I now declare open this public hearing of the Trade Subcommittee of the Joint Standing Committee on Foreign Affairs and Trade for the inquiry into strengthening Australia's trade and investment relations with Africa. I would like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which we meet today. I would like to pay my respects to elders past and present. I also acknowledge the cultures of any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people present with us today. This hearing will be broadcast on the Parliament's website, and the proof and official transcripts of the proceedings will be published on the committee's webpage. I remind members of the media who may be present or listening on the web of the need to fairly and accurately report the proceedings of the subcommittee. I now welcome representatives from Pay Dirt Media to give evidence today. For the Hansard record, would you please state your names and the capacity in which you appear before the Trade Subcommittee?
Well, good morning. My name is Bill Rippard. I'm the Executive Chairman of Pay Dirt Media. We publish magazines Pay Dirt and Gold Mining Journal.
I'm Dominic Piper, Editor of Australia's Pay Dirt and Gold Mining Journal.
Great, thank you. Although the subcommittee does not require you to give evidence under oath, I should advise you that this hearing is a legal proceeding of the Parliament. The giving of false or misleading evidence is a serious matter and may be regarded as a contempt of Parliament. The evidence given today will be recorded by Hansard and attracts parliamentary privilege and is being broadcast live. To assist with the transcription of the public hearing, it would be appreciated if you could please state your name before responding to each question. I now invite members that are here to introduce themselves.
Thank you, Chair. I'm Leon Rubello. I'm the Federal Member for McPherson on the Gold Coast.
And I'm Fiona Phillips, the Federal Member for Gilmore on the New South Wales South Coast, and I believe we will have Senator Smith joining soon as well. Great. So I now invite you to make a brief opening statement before we proceed to discussion.
Well, I'll just kick off. Just firstly say thank you for the opportunity to address the committee today and to receive our submission. Short and sharp, my company's been around in the, we publish magazines. We've been in the African space for nearly 30 years. We've watched the growth and development of the Australian footprint across the entire African continent. Australians make very good, the two things they do very well. They make very good miners, explorers, and they also make very good farmers. And Australian companies have been extremely successful in developing mines across the continent. They're also very good at employing and training people, and we believe that with more assistance from the Australian government, that we could be doing more. Australians could be doing more across the continent. In terms of current footprint, we addressed this. We were lucky enough to be part of a hearing some 5 or 8 years ago, when the last time, and basically not much has changed. And in fact, the Australian footprint in Africa is lessened, particularly in the trade area. Austrade have a reduced footprint to what they had since we last talked. And in terms of embassies, I think there's one more embassy, but again, there could be more. And in particular interest is the opening up of West Africa, where there are a number of very successful exploration developing companies working there, particularly in the gold and the iron ore sector. So that's basically my point.
Yeah, Dominic Piper, Editor of Australia's Pay Dirt and Gold Mining Journal. Yes, as Bill says, the trade and investment, particularly the investment footprint of Australian resources companies on the continent, has expanded dramatically over the last 25 years. We've charted that expansion both editorially through our magazines, but also through the conference that we run, Africa Down Under, which started in 2003. So it's entering its 24th edition in September this year. That first edition ran for a day and a half and had around about 80 delegates, including 2 representatives from African government. Last year, we had more than 1,500 delegates with representation, senior ministerial representations from more than a dozen African countries, including Prime Minister of the Kingdom of Lesotho, and in 2023 we had the Head of State of Botswana, President Masisi, represent his country and lead a strong trade delegation. They both specifically came for that conference, which sort of highlights the central role the resources sector plays in the Australian-African trade relationship. Estimates vary because it's impossible with listed companies to completely identify how many dollars are raised and spent in individual projects, but current estimates are around about $60 billion of Australian investment into the resources sector across the continent. And we have seen a number of highly successful companies develop projects there, build projects and operate projects. Companies such as Perseus Mining, who operate 3 mines in West Africa, Ghana, 2 in Cote d'Ivoire, and are building a 4th mine in Tanzania. West African Resources, a company that has built 2 mines in Burkina Faso despite huge security challenges in that country. Companies such as Sandfire Resources, which has built a huge copper mine in Botswana, and Base Resources, who built a sizable mineral sands operation in Kenya, to name just a few. But as Bill says, the diplomatic footprint of Australia probably does not match that resources investment footprint.
All right. Well, thank you very much for the opening statement. So you're talking about the Africa Down Under conference, and we've heard a lot about that from different witnesses through this inquiry. So it's great to have you here. So can you identify some specific examples of how the conference has enhanced trade and investment relations?
Bill Roper responding. I guess we started the Africa Down Under event due to the lack of understanding. We believed at the time that the Australian investment markets and the wider group didn't understand what Africa was about. And in fact, Africa was regarded by many as being one country, not a continent of many countries. And from that point of view, that was a big part of the advantage, the kind of kicking it off. The other point there with Africa Down Under was investors didn't appreciate the value of what Australians were doing. And so something that started very small became a pretty powerful and useful meeting, and was well supported by the Australian, by DFAT, by ambassadors would travel back to Perth and would work with us, encouraging African ministers to come to Perth. So in any one year, we might have up to 20 African ministers attend a 3-day conference here in Perth. And through those meetings, we believe we've helped develop the understanding of Africa and also develop the awareness of what these companies are doing. And there were some pretty good stories that my colleague Dominic was referring to.
So, some specific examples of how this conference and this forum aids that trade and investment interaction is that, as Dominic Piper, as Bill mentions, there's many African governments that attend the conference, both at ministerial level but also at department level. We work very closely with both DFAT, but also the West Australian State Government, and particularly the Mines Department here, to help visiting African delegations develop their regulatory frameworks around mining regulation, occupational health and safety, fiscal regulations around royalty regimes and so forth, and then environmental and other social and governance regulations and legislation as well. So examples such as Nigeria is a good example, Kenya and Tanzania are other examples of countries which have based their parts of their Mining Act and mining legislation on the West Australian model as a result of their interactions at the conference. from the investment side of the equation, many Australian companies have their first taste of Africa has been through the conference and meeting with visiting delegations who talk about the prospectivity, the opportunities, and the ability to do business in their jurisdictions. And so we can provide examples on notice of companies who have come to the conference for the first time, interacted with visiting delegations, and then invested in those countries. And then, of course, on the trade side, Australia is home to huge number of advanced METS, mining, engineering, technology service companies. And quite often these companies either follow or go hand in hand with the resources companies who are investing on the various countries of the continent. So companies who've grown up with the conference, if you like, companies such as Perrienti, the mining contractor, Lycopodium, the engineering services group, and many others who've moved into the continent, various parts of the continent, hand in hand with both the conference and with those listed resources companies who are investing there. Hopefully that gives you enough.
Yeah, no, that's excellent. Senator Smith?
Thank you. Thank you very much, and thank you for your participation. What are some of the key misunderstandings that Australians, whether they're mining companies or other business enterprises, what are some of the key misunderstandings that people have about Africa?
Yeah, Dominic Piper. I think it's a little bit difficult for us sometimes because we're so inside the tent, if you like, that we see some of the continued misunderstandings and some of the more general ones we perhaps feel that we've overcome, so others haven't. But I suppose in a traditional sense, that for a long time, a perception in not just in Australia but the Western world as Africa as a continent was full of war, famine, and disease. And the example, and there's absolutely no doubt that there's parts, individual jurisdictions, and whole regions, in some cases, of Africa that are still very challenging. Whether that's the Horn of Africa and Somalia and that area, or in the Sahel, where we see extremist activity in Mali and Niger and Burkina Faso. And other places within the continent. But I think the misconceptions are mainly around the ease of doing business and the ability to do business and the ability of host communities and host governments to operate in a transparent and skilled manner. The notion for new entrants is that they will have to bring all of their workers with them, and they'll have to import labour to enable them to build mines and to operate mines. This is simply not the case. A company like Perseus Mining, for instance, in their Edikan operation, I was just talking to the managing director on Monday, that is now a 100% Ghanaian, locally run operation. That's a mine that produces nearly 200,000 ounces a year. I don't know what the employee numbers, but 100% of their workforce, from the general manager down, is Ghanaian. Now, it's an Australian listed company with Australian management and an international board, but that's gone from around about 60% when that operation started more than a decade ago to 100% workforce. We see something very similar in Botswana with Sandfire Resources, where they've built the local workforce to nearly 100%. So there's that assumption. The second assumption is around bribery and corruption, and the idea that the only way to allow you to get forward in business in the continent is through bribery and corruption practices. This can be the case in some jurisdictions, but simply isn't the case across the continent. And I think Australian companies, their superpower, if you like, in this regard is the transparency required and the regulations required to operate as an Australian business, either through the ASX or ASIC or corporate law here in Australia, means they cannot, even if they wish, cannot participate in that type of activity, and are therefore elevated in the eyes of local government, local communities. They're known as best practice, and they're not going to participate in government. And I think, to go back to Bill's original point, one of the greatest misconceptions is Africa is a homogenous mass instead of more than 50 single jurisdictions, sometimes more depending on how you count them. within each of those, very nuanced ways of doing business, different cultures, different prospects, different economies, different speeds of economy. And so I think these are areas that we still need to overcome in our perceptions of Africa, and the fact that it's a dangerous place. As we said, the security challenges in many places, but I personally have travelled to 15 African countries, and personal anecdotal evidence, I've not had any security issues. And if you speak with most of the companies who operate there, while security needs to be front of mind, it's very possible to build mines, operate mines, and trade and invest in these countries if you go in with the right mindset. Sorry, Bill.
What is thinking about, so in terms of Western Australia's proximity to the east coast of Africa, how do we improve connectivity? So to get to Africa from Western Australia, you have to fly into Southeast Asia in order to get to Northern Africa, or you fly from Perth to Johannesburg and enter via. Are there opportunities that aren't being properly identified in terms of improving that aviation connectivity?
Well, Rappard, I mean, it's fair to say from Perth, we are serviced a lot better than we were 2 years ago. We now have both South African Airways back in business and Qantas back in reopening their Johannesburg routes. The alternative way to go, and if you go to West Africa, you go via Doha or via Dubai, and that's pretty efficient. But Australians are prepared to go wherever the opportunity, they will travel, and that makes it pretty exciting.
So distance and remoteness is not an inhibitor for Australian business when they're thinking about opportunities.
Bill Robert again. I believe it's one of the great parts of what the Australian work ethic is, that they'll go where there's opportunity, and that's what makes Australian geologists so good at what they do. Is their ability to get on with people, their ability to go to pretty tough places, and there is obviously very good Africa. There's good Africa and there's not so good Africa, and the countries where there isn't exploration, it tells the story. But there are still countries that haven't been explored that are now very much under the spotlight, and particularly in West Africa, Guinea, Senegal, Cote d'Ivoire are real hotspots that weren't on the radar 15, 20 years ago.
Dominic Piper. I think it's fair to say our aviation connectivity to Southern Africa is certainly strong through as Bill says, Qantas and SAA flying multiple flights into Johannesburg. To the rest of the continent can be challenging, and I wonder if, with the emergence of particularly Ethiopian Airlines and the strength of that airline now that connects, a colleague of ours has just flown to Cote d'Ivoire and Guinea in West Africa and flew through Thailand, Perth to Thailand to Addis, and then Addis on to Abidjan. So that feels like it could there could be a more direct route in that regard. Certainly, it's impossible from I don't have the details to say what the business value proposition regarding non-resources sector travel would be, but obviously with the increased African diaspora here in Australia, then I'd say there's certainly potential, particularly into East Africa. I think from a diaspora perspective, Ethiopia, Addis, Nairobi, Dar es Salaam, I think it would allow, particularly for other industries, I think it would allow for greater connectivity and business and trade opportunities.
One more question, if I may. Your submission, and you've mentioned it in your opening remarks, talks briefly about Australian technical assistance. Is this so Australian technical assistance, does that have to be in the form of government-sponsored technical assistance, or can it be in the form of private enterprise, private business opportunities, improving those sort of technical arrangements, whether it's the regulatory arrangements, whether it's attitudes or arrangements around royalty regimes or mining leases, etc. Is that an area that's a bit undercooked at the moment? And what's the real benefit? Is the benefit that it acts as a precursor to improving business confidence to invest in Africa, or is it that it provides a form of builds trust between a jurisdiction and Australia?
Yeah. Okay, Dominic Piper. Yes, it is possible, and yes, we are talking both government-sponsored. Going back, again, I'd have to check my notes. A decade that DFAT had, or the missions had their DAP program, small package that individual missions could posts could apply to different development grants. They used a number of those used that to engage the West Australian government, and particularly the Geological Survey of Western Australia, to travel to, again, not completely accurate, but I know it was Ethiopia and Kenya, for instance, who are very nascent mining sectors, to help their regulators develop their regulations and show them things around pre-competitive data and how to manage the exploration sector, which is something that the West Australians have expertise in. Yes, there is opportunity for other private business, and we're seeing a small amount of those companies like Parliamentary have brought in private training facilities, and you'll see many of the mining contractors and service providers, Australian companies on the continent, providing training and services, technical services, both for professionals, geologists, mining engineers, metallurgists, but also tradespeople and operator level jobs on the continent. So that's quite often what's happening there. For the companies, the mining companies themselves, to train public servants, slightly more problematic, and in fact it probably is a challenge in that public servants in many of these countries, their salaries are not competitive with the mining companies, and so if there's a high achiever in the mining, in the public service, quite often they're attracted to the private sector. But in doing this, in providing this technical assistance, yes, it does benefit improved business relations, improved trade and investment opportunities for Australian companies. One, because it's a predictable, understandable regulations and skill levels, particularly around environmental and social license issues, where they know that they're quite often bringing the standards with them and applying them above and beyond what the national standards already are. But by being able to match Australian standards with local standards, there's a level playing field for everybody. It does build trust with between, and it goes back to Africa down under. It builds trust with government departments, particularly senior public administrators, but also politicians, ministers, that Australian companies and Australia is on their side, if you like, and providing that skills and training that perhaps peer countries or competitors don't. And then it's about a fair and level playing field. I think, Australian companies, again, because of the strict standards that we apply here in Australian corporate law through the ASX, through ASIC, if they don't have a level playing field to participate on, they're gonna suffer when it comes to being awarded licenses or being awarded development of projects. And so by helping training and that technical assistance to both the regulator and on-the-ground operators, we're levelling the playing field that allows Australian companies to compete fairly with international competitors.
Thank you.
Great, thank you. Mr. Rebello.
Thank you very much, Chair, and thank you for attending before the committee. I have a few questions for you. The first one is in relation to the diplomatic footprint that Australia has in Africa, and I understand that your submission has talked about the current diplomatic footprint being a barrier to the growth of the Australia-Africa trade relationship. I'm just seeking your input as to where would or should we be looking to expand to?
Okay. Dominic Piper. Thank you for the question. Yes, I mean, the diplomatic footprint is, I think, again, in comparison to countries of a similar size and with a similar trade and investment footprint on the continent, and I'm picking Canada in particular because it's obviously a similar economy around mining, we lack the same resources and the same footprint as Canada. I think Bill mentioned earlier West Africa, and particularly Francophone West Africa is an area of huge importance to the Australian-African business relationship. There's more than 20 Australian companies operating there currently with many more opportunities and many more that have come and gone. At the moment, I think it would be fair to say that the Australian post in Accra, which covers, I think, 8, accredited to 8 countries there, the High Commissioner. That's a huge challenge for, particularly in a region that has shown signs of instability, but also shows signs of great opportunity as well, potential growth in that relationship, both from a mining perspective, but certainly other industries as well, around infrastructure, energy, and agriculture and agribusiness. And so I think a dedicated post diplomatic footprint in Francophone Africa would. I know there was some plans to open a post in Dakar, Senegal, more than a decade ago. That never transpired. I think one was opened in Rabat, Morocco, instead. And so I think, I think Francophone Africa is a huge. West Africa is a huge area. I think also East and Central Africa is an emerging area. At the moment, we're covered there in Nairobi and in Harare. But again, it's quite a dynamic area, particularly for that trade and investment, and also for the African diaspora here in Australia, with so many of those, even if families have come from other countries, many of the Australian African diaspora have been born in Kenya or Tanzania, even if they're from Sudanese or other backgrounds. And so I think increasing that footprint, whether through Dar es Salaam or elsewhere, could be very helpful. And, sorry, Bill, did you have anything to add?
I guess just to add, Bill Rappard, just to add to the diplomatic footprint, the Austrade footprint is very skinny on the ground across Africa. I think there's one senior trade commissioner based out of Nairobi, and that's about it. A couple of more junior people, I think one in Accra. But compared to other countries, the Australian Austrade trading side is very skinny, and we believe could be a lot stronger.
Thank you. The second question I had is in relation to government support in Africa. And I understand that Australia's main competitors, or you've said that Australia's main competitors have often got substantial government backing, which contributes to Africa being a challenging environment. I'm interested in what that substantial government backing looks like and what Australia or the Australian government should be looking to replicate.
Dominic Piper, thank you. I think for the main part, it goes back to your first question. It's the diplomatic footprint and the visibility of Australian diplomats in individual countries. Having spoken to current and particularly former heads of mission, it's very difficult if I think Abuja, Nigeria, they're accredited to 9 countries. In a 3 or 4 year posting, that's very difficult to get around and receive accreditation across those 9 countries, regardless of what's happening from an Australian interest perspective there. So I think in the first instance, it is having a greater presence in those regions. So, for instance, Canada, I couldn't list each of their missions in the region, but I know anecdotally Australian companies who will use the Canadian or the UK missions for some level of support, whether that's intelligence around security or diplomatic introductions to senior government leaders or so forth. Quite often you will see Australian companies register an office, particularly in the UK, so it allows them to use those diplomatic avenues that perhaps just don't exist. And I think it's fair to say, whereas a Canadian, a Toronto-listed company may go to their mission to gain some intelligence about operating in a country, whether that's security or business operations. In Australia's case, it's quite often the mission coming to the Australian companies that are operating in the region, looking for intelligence and looking for leads into how to operate, what's happening in that country.
Thank you.
That's good.
Chair, I have 2 more questions. I'm happy to ask them now or after.
No, yes, okay.
Yep, okay. Thank you. The next question I have is, you argue that the Australian government needs to play a role in the facilitation of high-level visits and management to support relations. And I understand from your submission that there are African nations who are interested in undertaking those visits. Is there currently a view that we as a country are not facilitating those visits, or that we view them as a low priority amongst, I guess, African diplomatic circles? Sorry,
Bill, it's in facilitation of high-level visits. Is there a view that we're ignoring them, or that Australia is ignoring them, or not paying them enough attention? And there's a lot of appetite for high-level visits from Africa to Australia, and it's not being facilitated.
Well, it's fair, sorry, Bill Ruppert, just picking up. Sorry, I apologise my hearing. Fair to say we've had 2 heads of country, heads of state join us over the years. One former president of Nigeria. In most recent times, the president of Botswana joined us 2 years ago, and that was at the initiative of ourselves and the Botswanan embassy, or High Commission in Canberra. And while it was pushed by the then ambassador, High Commissioner, there was not a lot of interest at the time from DFAT in what it was about, and we would like to see more encouragement of more heads of state being invited to come to Australia, because I think they get a lot out of it. They don't just come for the mining; they come to see the diaspora. They come and look at other areas, and Australia got some other things we're very good at, and dry farming particularly was of interest to President Masisi of Botswana, and he spent an extra 2 days looking at other things. Generally speaking, his visit was well supported, and all the bells and whistles happened. I think more recently was another program. Was it Angola?
Yeah.
The Angolan president was very keen to come to Australia last year, but sadly it just didn't work out. And this was the time when he was also chair of the African Union, and so from a point of view of Australia, that was we believe was a lost opportunity.
Yes.
So certainly we'd like to see more of those, more trips.
Thank you. And my final question is in relation to mining and related activities, which you've said will remain a cornerstone of African economic development throughout the 21st century. I'm interested in your view as to how the transition to renewable energy in Australia is going to affect the I guess our relationship with Africa. Is there an opportunity there for us to have further engagement with Africa, or is it the reverse, where the things we've traditionally relied on are not going to be relied on for a little while?
Thank you. Dominic Piper, I'll take that one. No, I think the transition to renewable energy offers, and Australia's expertise in that area, and particularly Australian mining's expertise in that area, offers a huge opportunity for greater engagement on the African continent. There's a discussion in Africa at the moment, and it has been ongoing for a number of years, around a just energy transition, in that I'm sure you're familiar with the argument that the Western world, who's had 250 years of exercising fossil fuel reserves to drive their economy and get ahead, is now looking at Africa that has some fossil fuel reserves and can exploit them, and saying, no, well, no, you can't use them now, you need to turn that. So there's an argument around a just energy transition. How can we allow African economies to still use fossil fuels in a way to help that's going to ultimately allow them to become better, more efficient economies, which will eventually reduce their fossil fuel usage. On renewables in particular, we see here in Western Australia the mining industry excelling in the use of solar particularly, but also wind and battery storage in the last 5 years in particular, a huge jump in that technology. There's a real opportunity on the African continent to use that technology as to vault over several generations. And there's no doubt that infrastructure and power in particular is one of the biggest blocks to enabling development on the African continent, development of industry, development of economies. And so by applying that knowledge, that technology, but also that know-how, infrastructure know-how of Australian mining onto the continent through solar, wind and battery storage, there is an opportunity for mining to become an enabler for other industries and for other sectors by building out these big power networks that, in traditional fossil fuels are just not going to be capable. But with energy storage, you can perhaps build a mining operation is going to build latent capacity that could be used by local agriculture, could be used by local ports and rail or whatever it may be. And so there's an opportunity, and I think it's an area that Australia needs to look at that expertise as not only as a renewable energy superpower, but also applying that to different industries.
Thank you.
Great. Well, I might just build on from that question as well. So I guess in terms of mining and mining equipment and technology, and you've talked about the benefits there for energy, what other lessons are there, for example, in growing agribusiness or other infrastructure as well? What can we learn from current industry to help to grow that in those other sectors?
Well, Bill Rappard, I think the no-brainer is of course mining. The commonality, we have a concentrated mining sector in Australia, and particularly Western Australia. In terms of agribusiness, agribusiness is all over the place, and it is quite hard to. We've had a look at trying to expand the coverage to go wider than just mining, but the agribusiness is a more it's more spread out. There are different areas of different expertise. I mean, for example, when, as I said, President Masisi joined us 2 years ago, he was particularly interested in dry farming and particularly interested in cattle. And so he spent part of his trip was spent taking a look at various studs around this part of Australia that had similar land conditions, but again, there must be lots of opportunity, but not yet realised, and we could be doing more on that.
Dominic Piper, I think some of the lessons to be learned are going back to those very questions we answered from Senator Smith early on of the misunderstandings and dispelling some of the myths around investing in Africa, particularly that one about Africa being one homogenous jurisdiction. Understanding, for other industries, understanding the local conditions and the local business settings and investment settings is crucial. And again, that goes back to the member's question regarding Australia's diplomatic footprint, in that by having more on-the-ground support, there's a better opportunity for whether it's an agribusiness or an energy infrastructure business to come in and talk to whether it's Austrade or the mission around the investment opportunities. And I think local partnerships is a really crucial area. Some countries have, in their mining sector, have a requirement for local ownership, but in other sectors, not necessarily so. But we've seen those most successful Australian companies are those who not only partner with local senior partners, but also work on the ground with local community enterprises and local businesses to allow that local content to grow, rather than again bringing in their own service providers and their own workers and so forth.
Great. Does anyone else have any questions?
I do, yeah. Just going to your point about Africa as this perception that, the incorrect perception that some people have, they think about Africa as one, when in actual fact it's a mosaic of places. If you had to group African nations based on their level of sophistication or reliability in terms of doing business, which nations would you group together? Because again, some people might think that there's some sort of a geographical association between them, but in actual fact, those countries that are most suitable for investment, that have regulatory settings that are attractive for investment, they actually could be in disparate locations over the continent. So which countries would you group together in terms of their attractiveness, reliability, suitable regulatory settings for investment? You see, you understand the point that I'm trying to make?
Sure,
Yeah.
If I go first, Dominic Piper, I understand and agree with your point, but I'm going to counter it immediately.
Oh, okay, yeah.
Unfortunately, I don't mean to, but
Yeah.
In the mining sector, and I think probably wider, it's fairly well unanimous that Botswana and Namibia represent the safest jurisdictions for foreign investment, in that they're predictable, transparent regulatory systems. Again, I'm talking specifically mining here. Yeah. It can be expanded into other sectors, with a strong rule of law, multi-party democracies, and an understanding of English common law and other aspects there. There's been very few or no cases of expropriation or international dispute, and many successes there. In no particular order, but also known for their amenability. Côte d'Ivoire has emerged over the last decade as a country that is, we now see more than a dozen Australian listed companies there, including, as I said, Perseus, that grew from a sub-market capitalisation of less than $30 million to is now more than $4 billion company, based off their operations there and in Ghana. Tanzania is a country that is a classic example of that challenge, because it can swing between. It's had a couple of investment landscape changes in the last decade, but it's currently on the up again. Malawi is a country that is increasingly viewed as a good place to do business and where your investment is going to be safe. And then Morocco, I think, although there's not really any Australian investment in the resources sector, Morocco is seen as a very safe place to do business and invest. So, yes, you're right, but it just happens the two that are most successful are right next door to each other.
Thank you for that.
Great. All right. Well, thank you. Well, thank you very much for your time here today. If you've been asked to provide any additional information, please forward it to the Secretariat. Please note that responses to questions on notice will be published on the website as submissions to the inquiry. You will be sent a copy of the transcript of your evidence to assist you with answering any questions taken on notice today, and you will have an opportunity to request corrections to any transcription errors. I now suspend the hearing. Resume the public hearing. I now welcome representatives from the Organisation of African Communities in Western Australia. For the Hansard record, would you please state your names and the capacity in which you appear before the Trade Subcommittee?
My name is Dr. Kasti Nyagayus, the Executive President of the Organisation of African Communities in Western Australia.
And my name is Rasini Adukunda, and I'm the Project Manager for the organisation.
Thank you. Although the subcommittee does not require you to give evidence under oath, I should advise you that this hearing is a legal proceeding of the Parliament. The giving of false or misleading evidence is a serious matter and may be regarded as a contempt of Parliament. The evidence given today will be recorded by Hansard and attracts parliamentary privilege. To assist with the transcription of the public hearing, it would be appreciated if you could please state your name before responding to each question. I now invite members of the subcommittee to introduce themselves.
Thank you, Chair. I'm Leon Rebella. I'm the federal member for McPherson on the Gold Coast.
And Fiona Phillips, the federal member for Gilmore on the New South Wales South Coast.
And Dean Smith, Senator for Western Australia.
I now invite you to make an opening statement before we proceed to discussion.
To the Chair and member of the committee, thank you for the opportunity to appear today. My name, as I've stated, is Dr. Kasti Nyaga, and I appear on behalf of the Organisation of African Community in Western Australia, OAC. OAC is the peak umbrella body representing African communities in Western Australia, connecting the 55 countries of Africa. Our submission makes one central point: Australia has a significant opportunity to strengthen trade and investment with Africa, but this will require more deliberations, coordination, and relationship-based approach. Australia's engagement with Africa has historically been concentrated in mining and extractive industries. Those sectors remain important, particularly here in Western Australia, but they do not reflect the full scale of opportunity across African diverse economies. Africa is experiencing rapid population growth and urbanization, regional integration, and growing demand in sectors where Australia has strong capabilities. These include agro-businesses, education and skills, professional services, technology, renewable energy, health, food systems, and creative industries. OAC key message is that Australians must be recognized and as part of Australia's trade and investment infrastructure. Our communities bring language skills, cultural knowledge, professional expertise, business network, and trusted relationship across both Australia and Africa. These are soft assets. They are practical tools for market access, risk reduction, and partnership building. We also highlight real barriers that need government attention, including limited treaty frameworks with Africa countries, the lack of double taxation agreements, regulatory and biosecurity barriers affecting agricultural trade, limited market intelligence, and underuse of diaspora experts. The African continent free trade area also presents a major opportunity. It allows Australia to think beyond individual countries and engage with emerging regional value chains across the continent. OAC, therefore, recommends a whole government Africa strategy that moves beyond mining, supports Australian SMEs, engage diaspora organizations formally, and aligns well with Australians' approach with African-owned priorities and African continent free trade area. In short, Australia does not need to build the bridge to Africa from scratch. The bridge already exists through African Australians. What is needed now is recognition, structure, and a partnership. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. So, in your view, what key actions can the Australian government take to integrate diaspora expertise into trade and investment policy?
One of the key areas is for Australia to look at Africa as a partner, not as an inferior or superior. We need to look at partnership, and we need to come up with strategies and legal systems and infrastructure which enhance trade, not just mining, trade between Australia and Africa, and particularly taking the already capital which is here in terms of human capital in Australia than the diaspora who are here from Africa.
Okay, and what about what barriers do you see preventing diaspora communities playing a more prominent role in business and government?
I think one of the major barriers which is there is lack of laws which are protecting our people who want to trade between Australia and Africa, lack of lack of tax laws which align well between Australia and Africa, lack of ways of being clear on how African goods can come to Australia and how that looks at when it comes to bringing maybe things which are not mining, agricultural goods. We've had many of our African traders getting their goods confiscated or not even leaving the African country. So those barriers are quite strong. The other barrier is where we need to have a exchange of skills, where people who are here can actually go back to Africa and bring a change. When we talk about mining, they just say that they go and build maybe a school, but we want to see that in a bigger way, whereby instead of us talking about just impacting a few people, it is a way whereby we can empower the transfer of skills, transfer of technology, both ways in Australia and in Africa.
Okay. I'd just be curious to get your views as well on, I guess, non-mining industries. Like, where do you, and you've mentioned education, but what other growth potential is there for trade, and also the role of women in trade as well?
Now, beyond education and beyond mining, we've got technology, especially the finance sector. In Africa, it is very advanced. You cannot compare it. In terms of empowering women, in terms of empowering small businesses, I think the businesses in Africa, that model they have can be brought here, and because there's a model which is used by Africans, whereby small businesses access funds which they have, not necessarily which banks have. That's a fantastic model. The second one is when it comes to women, there are some sectors where women thrive best, but they need support. And when we talk about support, they need funds, they need skills which are appropriately or culturally appropriate to them. Because sometimes the biggest hurdle to jump is those initial stages of them navigating both the Australian system and the African system. They were business people when they were in Africa. When they come here, starting that business, continuing that business becomes very challenging. It took me personally a very long time to navigate. I used to be a lecturer back home, and I used to run my own business. It took me almost 7-10 years for me to get back to the roots and get my business going. But we don't want that to continue. We want an environment whereby there are ways of us getting those women who are coming in the diaspora, either continuing their business or enabling them to do business between Australia and Africa, or even to do business here, which impacts Africa.
Okay. And just another question. So around the Australia Awards, alumni, do you have many alumni as part of your group?
Yeah, you want to talk about that?
Sorry, I didn't get a question.
Award night, are you talking about the award which are coming?
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah, we have an award which is coming in September, and that award recognizes key people within the diaspora who are working closely with the African community and who are working within the African community, and it recognizes different categories. We look at the emerging young leaders. We look at who are those who have the potential of leading in the space of the youth, either in academic or in business or in leadership or in various other areas. We also look at the women. We are very particular on the women, and we look at the women in leadership. What are they doing? How can we encourage them? How are they faring within the community, within the area of empowering women to take roles in senior positions? And OSC, in addition to the award, they have a program which they learn with Curtin University to empower women, a 6-month program, which is starting in October. And this is the 4th time we are learning it, and we have seen that impacting the business women. Last time we did it, we had one class where we empowered women, and all those women who were in that class, they have now started their business, and we are catching up with them to see how they are going. At the end of the course, they completed a business plan, and that's what they are implementing now. There is also innovation category, whereby we look at who has innovated something substantial, something which is impactful, something which is impacting not only the African community, but the Australian economy at large. And there is also the community champion. Now looking at leaving the business, leaving the leadership, we want to see who is impacting the community, the African community, and not only the African community, but beyond the African community. That's why we have the community champion. And then we look at who has got that resilience to stay being a community leader for over 10 years. And that's what comes as the community pillar of the year. And that looks at who is that who has been in the community for 10 years, trying to do things, not only community, but community, business, employment, all those areas, and not just the African community. This one looks beyond the African community, and we're looking at the Australian community at large.
Okay, thank you. Senator Smith.
Thank you very much, and thank you very much for your participation and your very comprehensive submission. I was interested in the comments you've made in your opening remarks, but also in the submission about the double taxation arrangements.
Yeah.
How is the community advocating for a discussion and improvement around those issues?
Now, when it touches tax, it becomes quite complex because it is not one way. It is Australian system agreeing with the African country, not countries. This is country by country because every country has got a different tax system. And what we're trying to say is that when we import things or we export things, there is double taxation. Can we start negotiations whereby if something is taxed here, then it shouldn't be taxed in the other country? Or if it is taxed in an African country, when it comes here, they should be able to get concession. That's the sort of thing we want to see, whereby trade becomes now, we make an understanding that when I import things and they have a tax, then I have already paid tax. So when it comes here, it needs to be recognized. Or if I am exporting, I have already paid tax if I have paid, and if I have not paid, then when I go the other side, I need to pay. That's the sort of thing we want to see happening, because in some of the countries, their tax are quite high, And when you have a double taxation, it actually inflates the price of items, and then it becomes very difficult for you to bring the items here and sell them without double taxation.
Now, do you have a view, going to your point about country by country, do you have a view about which 2 or 3 countries Australia should focus its attention on in trying to secure those better regulatory arrangements?
Yes, yes and no, because we are working very closely with Curtin University to see which countries are having trade ties with Africa, with Australia, because we want to prioritize where more goods are coming from, and we have a meeting with one of our research team to see which countries we need to prioritize. And most likely, there will be those countries whereby we are importing things from. A country like Kenya, a country like Sudan, where we know that there are certain countries whose goods are very specific. And when they come here, they have an immediate market, because that is what is lacking. And that's what we want to see. We want to see where those goods are coming from. And then we look at it and see what is the impact of tax in terms of the price.
Again, the Curtin University is speaking to us next, so that's an opportunity for us. So, turning to the matter of the diaspora.
Yes.
So the OAC is the peak organisation, representing many African community organisations. What is the right of varying sizes, and some communities are relatively new to Australia compared to more established communities. What's the right mechanism for government to engage with diaspora groups? We've heard some evidence previously that the Australia-Africa Advisory Council, which had been established, has been disbanded because it was largely, inoperative rather than ineffective. I think it had been not nurtured, might be the best way to describe it. So what, from your experience, what's the right way to engage with the diaspora communities?
Yeah, I'll jump into that. Because we've seen community members come to us and tell us some of the issues they're affecting, because we have people that are interested in doing trades. And there's a role of probably either a lack of information or not information available on the table. For example, if you want to bring goods from Africa to here, it can be an issue around biosecurity, there's a lot of restriction in terms of whether it's either license. For example, if you want to bring some coffee here, there's a lot of license required in terms of type of coffee to bring. It has to either can bring as roasted or non-roasted. So it's just those information and needs to be appropriate given, so that people are do not give up on the trade, because they're interested in doing that. There's so much opportunities and goods that can be brought to Australia, but we needs to be brought in a good way and by not jumping into anything else here.
So people that might want to import goods are having to navigate those regulatory arrangements in the absence of being able to go to a specific place to better understand what those arrangements or what those regulatory settings might be.
Yeah, I think that has been recognized, and that's why last year we had Global Connection Funding, which brought together people to talk about global trading. This year, it's still continuing, and we are having that is part of our strategic plan to bring together the business part of the associations. We have been very successful in bringing events together. We have been very successful in mentoring the youth. And now we have just gotten a funding which is going to be funding a position in our OAC office. And part of that position role is to see what is needed by the associations. How can we build capacity within the associations, either in terms of their leadership or in terms of their business? And looking at it, in a wholesale instead of just looking at just leadership. So that's something which we are looking at, and we are very particular on developing some materials or directing people to the right places where they can get information. If it is trade, if it is somebody who has just arrived in Australia, how can they get that information? Because what they're lacking is information. And sometimes our African people, they don't like reading a lot. We are not readers. You give us a lot of things to read. We produce through and we don't read the details. So we are looking at how can we translate that information either into a podcast, either into some ways whereby it is audio. They can listen to it. They can be able to know where to go and be told what is needed. So that's something which we are taking very, very seriously. Yeah.
Does the OAC have a African Business Council or a dedicated business group within it at the moment?
At the moment, no. What we have is a research department.
Yeah.
And that research department is the one which is supposed to pick the information and disseminate that information to the different groups. Last month, we were focusing on the information which goes to the seniors. And part of last year, we were focusing on information to be given to the young people. And now the next phase is looking at the information between now and September. We focus on the information which is going to be given to the global business people. So yeah.
Excellent. Congratulations for everything the OAC does do in Western Australia.
Thank you very much.
Excellent. Mr. Rebello.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you again for coming here before us. There are a few questions. I think Senator Smith took one of mine, but there are two key themes that I think you have outlined in your submission and in your presentation that I think are quite practical, one being the discussion about biosecurity and the other being the discussion about the double taxation agreements. I do think it would be, I know you said you've got a meeting with Curtin University, but I do think if there is a result in terms of which are the key countries of focus, I think that's something that the committee would benefit from hearing. So if that's something you're able to provide to us at a later point in time, I think that would be very useful. There are also, I guess when it comes to double taxation agreements, one of the challenges is they're quite negotiation resource intensive, and so from a country's perspective, you're wanting to negotiate with those countries that do have the biggest volume, and I think that's definitely something that's important to us. But in relation to the biosecurity side of your submission, and I don't profess to be a biosecurity expert, but my understanding is that I know you provided the example about yams. My understanding is that part of the reason that African nations are treated differently to, say, Pacific Island countries is because of the prevalence of certain, issues in relation to the products themselves. Is that something that you recognise, or are there any other examples you can provide the committee where you think that there's actually no justification for differentiation in treatment? So is there something that is what we would consider to be a low-hanging fruit that we could say, well, actually, we have addressed a particular virus in a product and or we've treated things differently and we're still experiencing discriminatory treatment by the Australian Border Security?
I think this area is quite sensitive, and when it comes to because it's case by case, and majority of the people who have brought things here, they have had problems in clearing them, in getting them over, and I think generally what our people say is that it is like there's an unending bias, which whether things have gone through the right channel, when they come, they are treated with suspicion. Okay? And that when that occurs, then it is very, very expensive for someone to have gotten a whole container, and then it comes here and it goes bad. That in itself is an hindrance. And when everything is treated with suspicion, which sometimes it is something which you cannot say because you can't pinpoint. Let me say that it is something which is in the people's sort of subconscious. And if that's the case, then we really, and that's what something we have been intending to talk to the ambassadors of the various countries, because this is something which needs to be coming right from the country where goods are coming from, okay? So that when they are certified by wherever country they are coming from, then that system of certification should be the same system which is being followed here.
Right.
Other than when it is certified there, then it comes here, it is sort of, it's like that certification was not enough. We need to do an additional one, and an additional one, and an additional one.
So it sounds like, and correct me if I'm wrong, but it sounds like it all comes down to communication, and maybe there's a better role for the Australians to communicate with those various governments so that we're not going through the process. And I think, it wouldn't be the intention of any Australian government to have that sort of a perception of bias. So maybe we need to be clearer, or maybe the Australian government needs to be clearer about our requirements, and that needs to occur both from a direct relationship with the various countries, but also with the people who are doing the exporting. Is that something you'd...
That's something which needs to be looked at.
Yes.
And I think we need to work with both ambassadors here and Australian ambassadors in African countries, so that the part of their role when they are there is to ensure that the systems which are being used to certify those things which are coming, they are on top of it. They have checked what systems are being used, because that's why they are on the ground anyway, part of it, I believe. Yeah. And so that by the time they come here, the systems are very clear that even, let's take, for example, if something is coming from Ghana, the Ghanaian government needs to understand what is Australian standard, what can we call a tick box. When they have ticked a box on their side, is that box being ticked in Australia? So when that communication is done properly, then that way you will find that it becomes, it's quite important. The same way we are having when people come here and they have done maybe nursing, they come and convert. They have a 1-year conversion program and they become qualified nurses. When somebody has maybe done engineering back home and they come here, there is no clear path. And that's why we are having professionals who are coming from Africa coming here and becoming taxi drivers, because some of those areas there is no clear way of conversion. And that's what you're saying, that some of those tick boxes, the same way we have a tick box for nursing, we need a tick box for engineers. We need a tick box for other professions, so that when somebody comes, they know that I am coming as an engineer, and if I come here, I do this course, I transition to be an Australian engineer. All right? So the same way we are dealing with goods is the same way we need to deal with education, so that we are talking the same language. Africa and here, we are talking the same language. We managed to get, I'm an accountant, and I was very key in getting accounting profession being recognized from my own country, that if you come and you are a CPA Kenya, when you come here, you only do 1 unit, and you become a CPA Australia. That's the sort of thing we want to see, whereby there's a clear cut. There's something which, if I'm importing, say something, avocado, when a tick box is done, wherever I'm importing them from, that tick box is the equivalent to what is being ticked in Australia. So that is very, very important.
Yes.
Yes.
Thank you. I think that's very, very useful to us. And I do have one more question. Curtin University, who will appear before us, in their submission, they've suggested the creation of a diaspora unit in DFAT, in the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade, in order to develop and implement a diaspora engagement strategy. One of the things that you've called for in your submission is integrating diaspora expertise into trade and investment policy. Is that something you'd support?
I support 100%.
Fantastic.
Because people want to see people who look like themselves.
Yes.
And we don't want somebody who is already biased. You know, it's a time for us to remove the bias and get someone who has got a critical mind, whereby when you look at something, because it's coming from a certain country, you're already looking at it like it is not good. You know, you see that. So that is very important. Very, very important. Yeah.
Thank you.
Any other questions?
Actually, I do have one more then. There are other bodies that have put submissions with us, and you speak about the bias, and it's something that I'm sort of very interested in. You represent a number of different organisations?
54 countries.
54 countries.
Yeah, and currently 55.
Do you think that there is no doubt that there is a certain level of racism when it comes to the bias, and that underpins the bias?
Yep.
In your experience, do you think that is being addressed? Do you think it is getting better? Do you think there is anything that government can do from a policy perspective to address that? Because that seems to be something that affects the way people perceive trade with Africa. It affects our foreign relations with Africa. It affects a lot of different things. What are your views?
My views is that this area, we need a sort of it's something within the system, if I would say. The system which was initially done or established did not take into consideration the difference between Australia and Africa. All right, that's one thing. The other thing is that the people who we are saying are biased are the same people who are supposed to be reviewing the system. Okay, so it becomes a vicious circle if you look at it. You know, because if you tell me I've got a problem and I'm the problem, I can't see that. I wouldn't be able to see that. And I think that's where sometimes we need to get, areas like Curtin University, academic, to come and inform the whole system. How can we address bias? How can we be able to make sure that where we are today, it is not where we'll be in 5 years' time? Because if we don't do anything, if we don't get some ways of addressing these biases, either perceived or actual, then we will be talking about the same thing in 5 years' time. When we started talking about diaspora, global connection and diaspora, it was about 3-4 years back, okay? And we sat down and we said, we'll keep talking and talking. We need to take action. So this is a time whereby we need to look at it and see how can we address biases? How can we ensure that the system is shaken a bit, even if it's a 5-year plan? How can we make sure that the officers are being, those who are involved at different levels are being educated on both perceived and real bias, okay? So that they can themselves recognize that they're doing it. Because sometimes you look at it and you look at what people are doing and the way they're addressing you and the way they're addressing things, and you're like, hang on here. Is that something somebody is doing consciously, or is this something which somebody has been doing for too long and it becomes normal? So it's something which really needs to be addressed. No, it's not something you can solve by just pressing a button. Yeah. It is a strategy which needs to be put in place to see how that can be addressed over time.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Great, thank you. Any other? Okay. Yep. All right. Well, thank you very much for your time today. It's been very, very helpful and interesting. If you have been asked to provide any additional information, please forward that to the Secretariat. Please note that responses to questions on notice will be published on the website as submissions to the inquiry. You will be sent a copy of the transcript of your evidence to assist with answering any questions taken on notice today, and you will have an opportunity to request corrections to any transcription errors. I now suspend the subcommittee's public hearing until 10:45 a.m. The public hearing. The subcommittee will now resume its public hearing for its inquiry into strengthening Australia's trade and investment relations with Africa. This hearing will be broadcast on the Parliament's website, and the proof and official transcripts of the proceedings will be published on the committee's website. I now welcome representatives from the Centre for Australia-Africa Relations, Curtin University, and the Australia-Africa Universities Network to give evidence today. For the Hansard record, would you please state your names and the capacity in which you appear before the Trade Subcommittee?
Thank you. My name is Associate Professor David Mickler. I'm the Dean Global for Africa at Curtin University and the Director of the Centre for Australia-Africa Relations. I'm also the National Co-Chair of the Australia-Africa Universities Network.
My name is Associate Professor Dominic Dagbanja, and I'm teach international economic law at Curtin University Law School. I also serve as the co-director of learning and teaching at Curtin University Law School.
Thank you.
My name is Ruwembo Goredema. I am a PhD candidate at Curtin. I also serve as Admin Officer for the Centre of Africa-Australia Relations and Secretary of Australia-Africa Universities Network.
Great, thank you. Although the subcommittee does not require you to give evidence under oath, I should advise you that this hearing is a legal proceeding of the Parliament. The giving of false or misleading evidence is a serious matter and may be regarded as a contempt of Parliament. The evidence given today will be recorded by Hansard and attracts parliamentary privilege. To assist with the transcription of the public hearing, it would be appreciated if you could please state your name before responding to each question. I now invite members of the committee to introduce themselves.
Thank you for joining us. Leon Rebello, the federal member for McPherson on the southern Gold Coast.
And Fiona Phillips, the federal member for Gilmore on the New South Wales South Coast.
And my name is Dean Smith, Senator for Western Australia.
Thank you. I now invite you to make a brief opening statement before we proceed to discussion.
Thank you very much. Thank you to the Chair and thank you to the committee for this great opportunity to speak to this important inquiry. My name is Associate Professor David Mickler. I'm the Dean Global Africa and Director of the Centre for Australia-Africa Relations at Curtin University, based here in Perth. And I'm also the National Co-Chair of the Australia-Africa Universities Network. I made separate written submissions to the inquiry on behalf of both the Centre and the AAUN. In these brief opening remarks, I would like to highlight a few common themes and recommendations. Firstly, there is significant potential for the deepening of Australia-Africa relations across various sectors, starting from a relatively low level of knowledge and engagement to date. Africa's economic and demographic trajectory is already shaping the future of global developments across markets, across talent, and across areas like critical minerals. And outside of the mining sector, Australia has not been awake to the substantial opportunities presented by engaging more strategically with Africa. Secondly, Australia currently lacks the adequate national knowledge and policy infrastructure that would be necessary to develop a national strategy for the long-term and sustainable development of Australia-Africa relations. Investing in this infrastructure and developing a holistic strategy are imperative at this point in time, and the work of this inquiry is an important contribution to this objective. Thirdly, the higher education and research sector can play a central role in helping to drive and support Australia-Africa relationships, including as a generator of its own economic value, but also in supporting other economic sectors through research, education and training, and academic diplomacy. Curtin University's campus in Mauritius, which is currently the only Australian university campus in Africa, is a great example of this at play. Fourthly, and finally, we recommend the development of new and the enhancement of existing key Australia-Africa knowledge and policy platforms, including, firstly, the development of a new Australia-Africa Council, which would be responsible for drafting a new national strategy. Secondly, the development of an Australian Centre of Excellence in Africa, which would bring together the Australian government, Australian industry and Australian universities to build capacity and economic development. Thirdly, enhancing existing platforms such as the Africa-Australia Centre at Curtin University and the Australia-Africa Universities Network. Australia and Australians are generally well regarded across Africa, but lesser known than other international partners and less visible than we could be. We operate there in the absence of an integrated national strategy and with limited resources. Similarly, most ordinary Australians have a limited understanding of or engagement with the African continent and tend to rely on unhelpful stereotypes. Together, these limitations inhibit the development of stronger relationships, including in trade and investment. I'd like to conclude by highlighting the growing significance of the African diaspora in Australia, both as agents of economic value, but also as bridges between our continents and societies. Our current Australia Research Council funded project on African impact in Australia, which my two colleagues will discuss, is examining the political and economic impact of Africans here in Australia. The diaspora should therefore be viewed as a valuable, if so far underutilised, asset to our country. Thank you.
Thank you. Would anybody else like to make an opening statement? Yes, great.
I will. So my name is Associate Professor Dominic Dabanja, and I am an Associate Professor of Law, International Economic Law at Curtin University Law School. And I will be speaking to the role of law in promoting Australia-Africa trade relations. I'm using law here very broadly to embrace both Australian domestic law and international law. The law is an enabler of trade and increased trade and investment between Australia and Africa, and it can facilitate economic engagement between the two continents. But the law could also serve as a barrier in terms of promoting trade and investment relations between Australia and Africa. Currently, the law has not been actively used by Australia to facilitate trade and investment engagement with the continent of Africa. Now, the population of Africans in Australia is growing, and with that comes with an opportunity to increase and diversify trade and investment relations between Australia and Africa, which today is currently concentrated in the mining and extractive sector. Australia has very limited bilateral investment treaties and regional trade agreements with African countries, and I'll give you some statistics. Australia has around 18 free trade agreements with 30 economies in force, including 13 with Asian Pacific countries. None of these free trade agreements is with an African country. Australia has 17 bilateral investment treaties in force, only one with an African country, which is Egypt, but 7 with Asian Pacific countries. Australia has double taxation treaties with more than 40 countries, but again, only one with one African country, which is South Africa. So this means that limited international legal protection for Australians and Africans who want to do business in Africa and Australia. For example, the absence of a double taxation agreement means that Africans who want to do business here and back home will be double taxed. Again, Australians who want to do business here, want to do business in Africa, could be taxed here and taxed in African countries in which they want to do business. So bilateral investment and regional trade agreements provide the legal basis for the protection of investment and trade. And the absence of very limited trade and investment agreement essentially means that very limited opportunities for international legal protection for businesses across the two continents. Now, Australian laws, domestic laws, also facilitate business because it allows individuals to set up and run businesses if they want to. But again, if we look at biosecurity legislation, that could serve as a barrier to trade and investment. And for example, yam, which is stable in Africa, can only enter Australia in peeled and frozen form. And essentially, that makes it very difficult. For example, a person like me coming from a farming community to engage in the yam trade in Australia. So biosecurity legislation is a major area that could serve as a barrier in terms of promoting trade and investment relations between Australia and Africa. So import legislation, domestic import legislation is an important area to look at. In conclusion, I'm making the point that to expand trade and investment relations between Australia and Africa, we need to visit the question of the law and its role in impeding or promoting trade and investment relations between the two continents. Currently, there's a research gap in that area, and we need to seriously look at that question. I will be open to further questions in the discussion period. Thank you.
Great, thank you.
Thank you, Chair. I'm Ruwembo Goredema, appearing as the PhD candidate for Curtin, the Admin Officer for the Centre of Australia-Africa Relations, and the Secretary of Australia-Africa Universities Network. My PhD scholarship is funded by the Australian Research Council as part of the ARC Discovery Project on African Impact in Australia. My remarks draw on aspects of my doctoral research, a national mapping of African diaspora organizations in Australia, and a national ARC survey of 834 African people in Australia, the first of its kind. I'll focus on one key point. The African diaspora represents a significant economic partner within our nation, one whose contributions are already evident, but whose potential has yet to be fully engaged. My research maps hundreds of African diaspora organizations registered across Australia, operating within established government frameworks, including ABR and ACNC registers. Where structure exists, the community uses it. This community is already trading, moving capital, and holding the networks and tacit knowledge needed to strengthen Australia's engagement with Africa. For those who participated in the ARC survey, 1 in 10 owned businesses. 1 in 10 of those business owners is already trading directly with Africa, with no treaty, no council, or support structure behind them. Nearly half of those surveyed send money to their family, to their countries of origin. That is an economic channel between two continents that already exists, and with the right structure behind it, could support enterprise and trade in both directions. These figures illustrate the breadth and significance of the African diaspora contribution to our nation. Trade activity between Africa and Australia is not hypothetical. We found it concentrated within this community, and it needs the right structures and institutions to reach its full potential, not only for Africans in Australia, but for any Australian business seeking to do trade with the continent. What is missing is a structure that connects the two continents. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much for those opening statements. So just a general question. So how effectively do you think Australia currently collaborates across education and research with African nations, and what can be done to support growth in this area?
Thank you very much for the question. I think within Australian universities there is an interest in Africa, but a lack of government incentives to promote engagement in that direction. Many of the Australian government incentives are to engage into Asia. For example, the new Southeast Asia strategy now prioritises Southeast Asia as an education source, and in terms of partnerships and so on. So the activities that we do see between Australian and African universities have really been swimming against the tide. The network structure that we've established through the AUN has been a helpful way of bringing together universities that otherwise perhaps wouldn't meet each other. But we really do that in the absence of any kind of Australian government resourcing or structured approach. There is significant interest within Australian universities, particularly from African diaspora scholars who have their own individual networks. And what we're trying to do is to connect individual networks to institutional networks at a wider level.
Great. All right. Thank you. And did anyone else want to make a comment on that, or?
Perhaps an area that the Australian government is doing well, the Australia Africa Awards scholarships, and that is a significant area that the Australian government is promoting education engagement between the two continents. But I think currently the funding is limited to masters, up to the master's level. So potentially to expand the scope of research, maybe the government could be thinking about expanding these to include PhD level research in relevant areas. Thank you.
Thank you. And your submission notes that African migrants are affected by Australia not recognising education and professional qualifications obtained in Africa, and it's something that we've heard of from other witnesses as well. Could you expand on this, and what suggestions do you have to align education and professional standards?
Yes, I think I have a point here in my presentation which I couldn't speak to. But essentially, I can cite myself as an example. I came here as a qualified lawyer in Ghana. I was admitted as a lawyer in 2005, so that's over 20 years as a lawyer. And I needed to, practice law here. I'm an academic now. Now, essentially, I had to be reassessed to complete the core unit for the JD or Bachelor of Laws program. And that essentially meant that going back to do a first degree in law. Ultimately, that was what I had to do. And then you go through the practical legal training, and then you go through the usual process that a typical first-year person from secondary school here will go to a law school to do. So there's no recognition from prior working experience that you bring back home and so forth. So you essentially more or less begin from the scratch. And it is a similar thing you can find in the medical profession, you can find in the nursing profession and other areas. There are requirements around English language competency where, in spite of all of your education from Africa in English and even work experience here, you still be required to do, an English language test. To the extent that even a completion of a university degree in Australia doesn't meet the English language requirements for purposes of entering into the professions. So these place limitations in terms of people's ability to go into the professions that they are already ready to go to in the first place. So, and of course, visa requirement tying employers to, tying migrants to certain nominated employers also limit their economic agency. So there are quite challenges around here in terms of getting settled when you have come in with requisite requirement that you should essentially seemingly, fit into the system. So it is an area that I think the Australian government could seriously be looking at. Thank you.
Okay.
My approach to education is a little bit more broadly speaking, and I'll also give a little example. I'm originally from Zimbabwe, and my cultural knowledge of Australia came from watching Skippy and other Australian cultural things like Neighbours. By the time I arrived to Australia, I was very familiar with who Kylie Minogue was, right? And this is something endemic in terms of there is a large cultural knowledge regarding Australia within Africa, particularly in Anglophone-speaking African countries. So people are not coming from Africa without a knowledge of how Australian systems or an Anglophone system works. The cultural exchange of music, food, movies, film, has a really broad impact to how perceptions are created regarding the literacy levels that both Australians and Africans need about each other. And this is an area of opportunity if given the space to grow. There are many African organizations here in Australia that bring films and festivals to try and create that educational sphere. But yet the schooling system, I'm sure many schools are not aware of the different African languages that are there and are not willing to teach or to understand what's happening in different African countries. Also, the exchange of Australian people to come to Africa to learn, to see on the ground what it is to innovate, to see on the ground what it is to be a person from Africa with certain ICT skills and be innovative. So there's an opportunity here where the governments of both African governments and Australian governments can look at cultural exchanges and support institutions, particularly university institutions, to get Australian students over to Africa to learn and vice versa. This is not impossible. It's being done with other continents, and it can be done with Africa too.
Just add a point to that. The New Colombo Plan, which is a fantastic plan to send Australian students to Asia and Pacific, has a very long success, but it has excluded Africa. So there's no current Australian government-funded scheme to take Australian students to Africa for short-term study. And this really does limit the ability for Australian students to learn about the continent. And of course, we know from the New Colombo Plan that those who have been to Asia and the Pacific come back as ambassadors for those regions, have a much different perspective. We did make a submission to the review of the New Colombo Plan suggesting a trial of some African countries, but that wasn't adopted. So it's a real barrier to actually moving young people in a study environment across to Africa currently.
Okay. And just one final question from me. Both submissions recommend the need, and I think you mentioned that in the opening statement, for a National Australia-Africa Council. How would such a body be structured, and what role would academic institutions play in that?
Thank you. Yes, we would see this as an important first piece of a puzzle towards developing a national strategy for Australia-Africa relations. Currently, we don't have any standing platforms that bring together the key sectors, such as the education sector, such as the diaspora sector, the business sector, into a regular conversation with government. As you're probably aware from the committee's work, there's quite a lot going on in these different sectors, but there's no common meeting place where we can actually provide advice to government. So we would recommend some kind of structure, whether it's a council or some alternative, is established to have a regular meeting point between those key sectors, where we can obviously bring information to government, but we would also hope to have government help to coordinate across those sectors so that we can have much more impact in what we do. It would, of course, be an advisory type of body. It could develop into something which is also a granting authority, but it doesn't have to be that. I think in the first instance, we're just looking for that regular point of contact with government, certainly from the education sector, but we know from colleagues across sectors that's also something that they're quite keen to have the opportunity to be part of.
Great. Thank you. Senator Smith.
Thank you very much. Who is the most prominent sporting or cultural ambassador of Africa or for Africa in Australia?
I would say, well, Gout is pretty well up there. I think after the Socceroos, you could probably have some new contenders. Yeah. So certainly in the sporting field, I think there's been quite a high visibility of African Australians. Perhaps also in music. I guess, without knowing where your question is heading, one of the areas that our research is showing is that many African professionals would also like to be known in their fields as well, outside of sort of the entertainment sphere. So the ability to be recognised as African Australians in law or in business or in medical profession, that's probably not something that we see publicly, that kind of acknowledgement.
What is the rationale for excluding Africa from the Colombo Plan opportunities?
We didn't receive any written response to the submission on that. I mean, I understand it is very much tied into the Indo-Pacific strategy, which I completely understand and makes a lot of sense, and it's an excellent program. So perhaps it would be a separate program that would do a similar thing, which is all about giving young Australians that opportunity to physically travel to Africa and to do so in a structured study environment. So we don't know the reasons why that wasn't adopted.
But it demonstrates your point that in the absence of a Africa strategy, then it's easy for these opportunities to be overlooked or consciously ignored.
Yes, that's true. I don't know if colleagues wanted to.
Yeah, I mean, talking about the establishment of a centre in the manner proposed by Professor David Mikler, I think both Africa and Australia haven't figured out what they want to do with each other and the potential for working together in a mutually beneficial manner. Currently, we have, representatives from Africa in the form of ambassadors and high commissioners and so forth. But that area is very quiet, and we don't know the level of engagement between, say, government representatives here, the Australian government. These are very important sources, reference points that we could use to really activate the engagement between the Australian continent and the African continent. Currently, I think the two continents really haven't utilized the opportunity to collaborate and work together. And establishing a center that focuses on that will bring all the different parts that are currently in the system. In terms of your question around ambassadors, of course, it's not because David is my friend, but I think he's doing an excellent job. The two of us were working at the University of Western Australia and before we moved across there to Curtin Law School. And David was active in the setting up of Africa Research and Engagement Centre at the University of Western Australia. He moved across to Curtin University, and he was the brain behind the Centre for Australia-Africa Relations. He and I have worked very closely, and so I think he's a reference point in any conversation, as far as I know, and if I can objective about that in terms of Australia-Africa relations. Beyond that, at the individual level, if you go to the university, those of us who are university lecturers are research actively on Africa, but also increasingly on Australia-Africa relations. So there are all these efforts at the individual level that needs to be harnessed for the good of the two continents. We are working in a very disaggregated individual level, and if we can find a way of harnessing all of these efforts, we can really strengthen the relations between the two continents and promote trade and investment. Thank you.
You made some observations about sort of legal gaps. Where should Australia focus its activity when thinking about Africa? It's not realistic to be able to focus on all of Africa, and of course certain nations are at different stages of development, etc. Where should our focus be? Which countries should our focus be on, or which regions of Africa should we be focusing on?
I wonder whether it would be realistic to suggest a region without really engaging in some form of research, looking at where the potentials lie. And I'll not be doing a good job if I were to specify any country at the moment. Currently, the focus, as I said, is in the mining extractive sector. But it depends on what we want to focus on. And unless we engage in some form of research looking at where are the potentials and how can we pick and build on that. You could see South Africa, looking at the population. You could see Nigeria. You could see Ghana, which is my home country. Ghana is my home country, and so forth. But I think that question in itself needs to be looked at. If we want to expand trade and investment relations, where is the area? What is the subject matter of trade and investment that we want to engage in the first place? This is a crucial question that we need to address. And of course, as I referred to the law aspect, there's research gap, there's knowledge gap in terms of how the law limits, inhibits trade and investment between the two areas. Again, that is a question that needs to be critically looked at, and it hasn't been answered. In terms of the capacity of Africa to bring trade and investment here, maybe the small-scale business person, for example, that is a crucial area, and laws and regulations could essentially be a limiting factor in terms of getting this business sector to operate in Australia.
A final question for me. is part of Australia's bias, so a product of Australia's bias, so is it a product of Australia's bias that we tend to focus on those parts of Africa with an Anglo heritage, English speaking, and we're not conscious of that bias, so we might be missing opportunities in those parts of Africa with a French or other heritage and language skills?
Yeah, and historically that's been the case, and it has been much easier to engage through the Commonwealth and through the Anglophone countries, including those in the West African side, Ghana, Nigeria. Geographically, of course, East and Southern Africa is that much easier. One of the big challenges we face is the limited number of direct flights between Australia and Africa. I think it's only Perth, Johannesburg, Sydney, Johannesburg, Perth, Mauritius, that's it. So it's very difficult to get to other places. So I think for those reasons it does make sense to concentrate on the Anglophone East and Southern African side in the first instance, and perhaps establish some capability there first before looking beyond that. But I guess countering that is that the mining industry is working right across everywhere. So there is an Australian interest in West Africa, in Central Africa and so on. I think a prudent strategy would be one around looking at hubs in some of the sub-regions, so maybe an East African hub, a Southern African hub, something in West Africa, where you would have an Australian concentration, but that would then allow you to bring in neighbouring countries around that. So something like the Centre of Excellence that we mentioned, that could be something that you could put somewhere but draw in others from around. But I think it would have to be phased. You know, you'd have to start with those that are easier, and that is the Anglophone East and Southern countries, and look at what's possible beyond that.
Thank you.
Yeah, just to build on that, on my research, every African country, at least preliminary, has got an organisation that has some sort of collective here in Australia. And that surprised me as well, because I didn't think there'd be every African country having some sort of informal or formal organization. And so the linkages, if done right and the structure and communication is clear, to start internally with engaging with countries that are francophone, lusophone, it is possible, and to get that insider knowledge that you might not regularly have access to. There are people from those countries who are here, who are very knowledgeable and are formalized. So, you know, just to use what's homegrown, so to speak, as well.
The observation I would make from your evidence and your submission is the lack of structure for our engagement, whether it's cultural, economic, strategic. The lack of any structure means that nothing is perhaps as impactful as it could be, and then there's no entry point for discussions around expanding Colombo Plan or whatever the case may be. So it's the absence of any structure at all.
Yeah. I think that's probably the central point that we would make, is that really to start a strategic conversation you need to bring the right people to the table and then think through the different sectors, what they're already doing, but how that can be connected up to government policy. That's not happening currently. So there is all this work going on amongst universities, amongst the mining sector, amongst the diaspora communities, but it's happening across each other rather than coordinated through government. And again, we're not saying it has to be something that's funded, but there needs to be a coordination by government 3 times a year, perhaps. You know, just a meeting.
Beyond Africa Down Under.
Beyond Africa Down Under. That's obviously one of the meeting points, but there's very few outside of that currently. And even that's not fully structured in a way that gets the most out of all of this activity. So if there's one key point that I think we're making, is that Australia should think about a strategic approach which would get the right people around the table to develop a strategy that would then maximise what is it's only going to be a limited investment, we understand that, but to make the most of a limited investment, it would be good to have a bit more strategic thinking behind it.
And I think the Australian government has done well with the various committees that have been set up over the years, and looking at the question of Australia-Africa trade and investment. And it's an area of research interest to me, which I hope to pick up and build. But having that kind of strategic approach is crucial, because part of it is the lack of knowledge. That what are the opportunities? What are the opportunities in the system, and how can we utilize them? And if we don't have the knowledge, there is no way we can really act. So we need that kind of strategic approach to thinking about the engagement between the two continents, identifying the opportunities, the challenges, and how to go about addressing them. If we do that, I'm sure we can work in a manner that will be mutually beneficial to the two continents.
Just one quick final point on that one. We might look to Canada, who have just put out their own national strategy for Canada-Africa relations. We often look to Canada for other comparative reasons, but they're in a similar position. I think Australia and Canada are the two largest mining investors into Africa. Similar diaspora populations, similar Commonwealth connections, but they've already taken the step of putting together a national strategy, I think about 6 months ago. So this is something that we could look at as a model for Australia.
Thank you.
Mr. Rebello.
Thank you very much, Chair, and thank you for being here. I have a few questions for you. The first is in relation to the demographic findings. So one of the things you've found is that migrants from northwest and southern Africa have a higher prevalence of tertiary qualifications than other overseas migrants, and the Australian-born population as well. However, unemployment for African migrants is higher than other migrants and Australians, which is insane. Can you tell me, why do you think that is the case?
Yeah, so certainly, and part of that is to do with obviously the migration stream, migration policy that brings people here from different regions. Many come through on skilled visas as opposed to people from other regions of the world. So migration policy does play a role in who comes here and what level of qualifications they have. But I think it also speaks to the mismatch of qualifications and employment, and the role of discrimination that gets in the way of that, that my colleague spoke of earlier. This is something that we have identified, is that people are not necessarily working in the jobs that they are fully qualified to be doing, and you would look at some of the barriers that have prevented them from doing so. My colleagues can probably expand on some of those points.
I think, well, just to build on the migration aspect, is that, look, there's definitely a skill assessment process for most countries in order for you to be seen as working or having a qualification at the required level and relevant. And so that barrier, or not that barrier, or that criteria is met upon entry. But then in practice, that's the question that we are putting towards industry, and we're putting towards communities to say, well, what is happening where at the entrance you are seen as your qualification is relevant and at the required level, but then in practice, what happens and what are the challenges that people are facing? And some of the respondents in our survey have acknowledged that, yes, discrimination does play a role. However, they've also found ways to be innovative around discrimination, looking for self-employment, creating their own businesses, or reaching out to different associations and professional associations to get more support in terms of navigating the corporate or workplace things that they need to face with. So, yes, there's a discordance that is there, but it's really about an open conversation regarding some of the discrimination that people experience.
And I'll touch on the discrimination in a moment, but if we put the discrimination to a side, does that mean, I mean, you have a lot of people migrating to Australia from non-African nations. They seem to have similar challenges in terms of the translation of their qualifications to Australia. Is there any other, apart from the discrimination, is there any other barrier that's specific to people migrating from African countries that makes it more difficult for their degrees or their qualifications to be translated and recognised in Australia?
I can respond to that. So I mentioned the case of legal profession. if you come from South Africa, you probably, and you want to get into the legal profession, you probably will be required to complete roughly about 4 units, say from the Legal Practice Board of Western Australia. If you come from any other African country, you essentially need to complete everything. Now, if you look at, say, the US, there's a measure of recognition of prior legal practice experience if you seek to enter into the profession, say from the US and so forth, and probably from the UK. Of course, people from the UK also need to complete a certain number of units, relatively around 4 units or thereabout. But if you come from the African region, you essentially need to go back to school. That is what I did. I am a typical example of that. And in fact, even while I was teaching in the University of Western Australia, my permanent resident visa application was refused because I had not gone for an English language test to prove my competency in English, even though I was teaching in the university and I needed a permanent residence to continue the same job. So I think it is peculiar. I wouldn't say that Africans and black people are targeted. I wouldn't say so. Probably Africa was not a priority for Australia in terms of economic engagement, and somebody hasn't sat down to think through what people are bringing to the Australian, continent. So I think there's a peculiar case of saying that people of African background do go through peculiar challenges that others may not necessarily go through. Thank you.
Just one other factor that might be important here is the longevity or the lack of longevity of the African communities here relative to other communities, and the role that professional networks play over time in helping people get into employment. So we hear from many of the African diaspora members that they don't have those professional networks yet in Australia. And it takes time to build those, and they're obviously crucial in terms of translating your qualifications into employment, or they play an important role in identifying jobs and obviously knowing people in the industry and things like that. So a lot of the work we do is with the African professional associations who are really trying to promote African professionals in the different fields and the business connections that come with that. So it might be a factor of time as well.
And just stemming from that point, the Centre for African Relations previously, I think it was, it was the previous witness, which was the Organisation of African Communities in Western Australia. They, I put the question to them about the diaspora unit in DFAT, which was a suggestion from you, and they seemed very supportive of it. I'm just interested, it's a very practical suggestion from a policy perspective. I'm just hoping that you'd be able to just talk to that, about the effect that that could have on putting people with experience at the centre of not only foreign affairs policy but also trade policy, and how would that situation compare to what we currently have?
Yeah, absolutely. This idea of diaspora diplomacy, I think, is a really interesting one. It's certainly something that African governments use in terms of courting the diaspora and seeing them as important sources of knowledge and potentially resources, remittances and so on. From the Australian government side, I don't think there's been a systematic thinking through of how to engage the diaspora for the purposes of developing foreign policy or economic policy. It's done in an ad hoc way around particular issues, but we don't have, a structure that brings the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade into a regular dialogue with diaspora communities.
Are you aware of something like that, a diaspora unit or something like that for any other countries?
I know African governments have diaspora units in their own governments to engage their diaspora. In terms of Western countries,
or the Australian?
Not sure.
No.
But when we say diaspora unit, that would be a unit to engage all diasporas, not just African diasporas.
Yes.
But we would obviously advocate for African diaspora to have a role in that. It's about giving those with that knowledge and experience a more direct way to engage government because of all the business connections, the knowledge of markets, the cultural knowledge that would benefit the Australian government in terms of how it would then set policy for engaging in those regions. I think it would be a relatively simple mechanism, again, creating a dialogue in a more structured way
Yeah.
that could really think through, because again, Australia is a multicultural nation with many diasporas here, and the foreign policy should draw on that as a resource. But we currently, as far as I can see, don't have a formal structure to really capture that in a regular way.
Thank you.
All right, we might have to finish there today. So thank you very much for your time here. It's been very, very useful. If you have been asked to provide any additional information, please forward that to the Secretariat, and please note that responses to questions on notice will be published on the website as submissions to the inquiry. You will be sent a copy of the transcript of your evidence to assist you with answering any questions taken on notice today, and you will have an opportunity to request corrections to any transcription errors. I now suspend the hearing. The public hearing. I now welcome Brendan Augustin to give evidence today. For the Hansard record, would you please state your name and the capacity in which you appear before the Trade Subcommittee?
Good morning, Chair and members of the Subcommittee and Secretary. Thank you for the opportunity to appear before you today. My name is Brendan Augustin and I appear today in a personal capacity.
Great, thank you. Although the subcommittee does not require you to give evidence under oath, I should advise you that this hearing is a legal proceeding of the Parliament. The giving of false or misleading evidence is a serious matter and may be regarded as a contempt of Parliament. The evidence given today will be recorded by Hansard and attracts parliamentary privilege. I now invite, to introduce yourself.
Thank you for joining us. Leon Rebello, the federal member for McPherson on the Gold Coast.
And Fiona Phillips, the federal member for Gilmore on the New South Wales South Coast. So I now invite you to make a brief opening statement before we proceed to discussion.
Thank you again and pleased to meet you and welcome to WA. My views are informed by more than 2 decades of experience working specifically on Australia and Africa trade and investment across government, industry, and foreign policy. It also adds to a 30-plus year career that involved foreign affairs and trade initially, working mainly in Southeast Asia and Europe. So I do not come to this Africa-focused inquiry with just an Africa perspective, but as a global positioning in Australia's foreign and trade policy. During that time, working on Africa, and in Africa. I've been involved both in direct advocacy to strengthen Australia's engagement with Africa and in strategic policy work, including at one time assisting Peter Coleman, then CEO of Woodside and chair of the Advisory Group on Australia-Africa Relations, AGAR, in preparing the 2016 AGAR report, which I assume the subcommittee has had a look at, which was a very extensive set of recommendations across Australia-Africa relations. I've also had the opportunity to work on major Australian commercial investments in Africa, including the Sangomar project in Senegal, which is one of Australia's largest investments on the continent on nominal terms, over $5 billion US invested. I've lived for periods of time in Africa, totaling about 5 years in the last 20 years. Australia has the capability, expertise, and strategic rationale to be doing considerably more in Africa than it currently does. Australian companies, especially from Western Australia, have already demonstrated what is possible through significant investment across mining, energy, agriculture, and related services. There is no shortage of ideas. Previous reports and inquiries have recommended expanding Australia's diplomatic network, increasing Austrade's footprint, and strengthening institutional engagement with Africa. But with some regret, my experience has been that Africa has too often struggled to attract sustained political attention or resources within Australia's foreign and trade policy system. Since 2016, the report from AGAR to AGAR and from AGAR to the foreign minister at the time, we have arguably seen further retrenchment rather than expansion. That is why my submission focused on what some may regard as a boutique recommendation. It comes from a degree of frustration, but also from pragmatism. Rather than putting forward another broad wish list, I wanted to identify one modest, affordable, and achievable recommendation. I recommended in my submission that Australia establish work and holiday arrangements with at least 3 African countries over the next 5 years. Australia has reciprocal work and holiday arrangements with a wide range of countries. Around 45 countries, if we include both the more expansive working holiday program and the more restrictive work and holiday program. These includes smaller countries such as San Marino, Luxembourg, Slovenia, Uruguay, and Ecuador. Yet not a single African country is included. A carefully capped pilot program would be a modest step, but it will send a meaningful signal that Australia is serious about building people-to-people links with Africa. Links that over time, as we have seen with other programs with other countries, support trade, investment, and diplomacy. It would not cost Australia a cent, especially given the cost of applications these days are meant to cover processing costs. Thank you, and I look forward to your questions.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you for being here today and for your opening statement as well. So I'll just start with a question about what do you see as the key opportunities that lie for Australia to expand its existing trade and investment with Africa?
I think they are very broad. We start with where our strengths are and where we already are in terms of the mining and resources sector, the services that goes along with it. The investment already is quite significant in mining exploration and mining services. So that is one area where it could be further expanded, especially given the rush to critical minerals and the global need to diversify supply chains. So things like more minerals, but also more processing in Africa and Australian investment involved in that ecosystem. But beyond that, I see the opportunity for education, There is a lot of demographic growth in Africa, as you've probably seen through your committee work. It is where the demographic growth is expected to be over the next 50 years. Africa has, and I talk in Africa, obviously it's a very large number of countries, over 50 countries, but there are definitely pockets where there is income growth, middle class growth, and a search for services such as education, where Australia has been already successful. And I think you had David Mickler earlier, he would have expounded on that, the education prospects for education services, tourism, agriculture, both in terms of agricultural services, know-how, but also two-way trade in agriculture. Africa is growing in ways that I think a lot of Australians don't understand or are aware of. And I'll give you just one example, if I may. The mobile phone and data telephony that has come along with it. Africa has been able to leap through the fixed line conundrum. And when I started working in Africa in 2005, I can tell you the internet was extremely difficult. These days when I go in, I'm 600, 700, 800 kilometers inland, and there's fiber optic in some countries, right up to 500, 600, 700 kilometers. And the internet is faster than it is here. And you can take that technology leap to other you can make other comparisons around energy, decentralized energy. You are going to see technological leaps that will assist Africa resolve some of those infrastructure issues like telephony through new technology. And that is going to create opportunities for EVs in farm equipment and agricultural inputs to increase. So I guess it's a very broad question. I focused on, I guess, our key area of trade and investment at this point in time, but I think there are many more opportunities that can come from the general economic growth, rising wealth, rising incomes, and the increase in the demography of Africa.
Great, thank you. And your submission suggests that the expansion of trade with Africa should be done in an incremental, affordable and defensible manner. Can you provide further detail as to how Australia should approach expanding its trade with Africa?
So when I talk about that, just to be more precise, I talk about Australia's policy support for, towards improving trade and investment. What I mean by that is what I referred to in my opening statement, which is both the diplomatic and the Austrade footprint in Africa. As we know, it's fairly limited. What I was suggesting in the submission is it would be unrealistic from a policy sense to go from where we are now, say, to double the diplomatic missions, or to increase by X number per year, or Austrade, which, since the 2016 AGA report, has closed missions rather than open new ones. So I think it comes from a sense of realism. So in terms of what support the federal government in particular can put in place, should be done in a measured, realistic way. I hear often, when I've worked in industry, a very broad and demanding wish list, or you should go and open, I've been parts of discussions with foreign trade ministers, or you should go and open new missions in X number of countries. You should increase Austrade's footprint in X number of countries. You should do this, you should do that. And it's not within the realm of the possible. Being an ex-foreign affairs official myself, I don't think that's on the cards. So my suggestion is think about how best to spend your incremental dollar. Maybe increasing the number of staff by 1 or 2 in a current Austrade office. Maybe increasing the number of staff, diplomatic staff, in an existing embassy and giving them a bit more travel budget so they can travel to more countries, giving them a bit more language training. So, for example, there's very little coverage in Francophone Africa, right? I think if you can call Morocco a Francophone country, that's the only Australian mission in a Francophone Africa location. So we are really not well served in Francophone West Africa, where there's a lot of Australian investment. So it's increasing, from a realistic perspective, a bit of the bandwidth that the Australian government can provide to support the trade and commercial expansion of Australian interests. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that's great. Thank you. Mr. Rebello.
Sure. Thank you, Chair. Just on that, so we've had a few prior witnesses before the hearing today speak about the need to expand the diplomatic footprint in Africa, the Australian diplomatic footprint. So am I correct in saying that your focus is, or you suggest the focus should be on making the existing diplomatic footprint more effective and giving them more resources?
I'm saying that's the first step.
That's the first step, yeah.
Because I've sat here for the last 25 years working on Africa policy, and I've seen many companies and many advocates coming and bang the table and say we need more diplomatic missions. I've had private conversations with successive foreign ministers, and it's not like this, it's like this.
Yeah.
So, I mean, in my frustration, I said, okay, what can we actually achieve?
Yes.
Right?
Okay, so it's a practical step.
It's a pragmatic.
All right.
I'm a former public servant, so I come from a perspective of pragmatism.
No, thank you. I appreciate that. That's very useful. The other question I have, so just in relation to your recommendation of establishing work and holiday arrangements with at least 3 African countries in the next 5 years, I'm interested in the benefit to Australia. So if you could talk a bit to the benefit of what that would bring. Another theme that's come through today during the hearing is the fact that we have a lot of people coming to Australia from African nations who are not being, or who are being underutilised due to the conversion of their education or of their qualifications. How do you see, if we're wanting to better utilise the African diaspora, how do you see the focus should be placed in terms of the work and holiday arrangements on the one hand, and on the other hand it's the better utilisation of the conversion of their degrees?
I think they're two separate issues. Work and holiday arrangements have worked very successfully for Australia over many, many years. And I've been lucky as a former DFAT official to meet, for example, ministers in Europe who came, 20 years prior as a working holiday maker, business leaders, trading opportunities that have come, and commercial. They've been advocates for Australia because they spent 2 years, 3 years picking fruit, stomping on wine, all that kind of, and Australia has seen it within itself to expand that program over the last 30, 40 years, right? Including the work and holiday, which is a more restricted one. We're seeing that expanded. I worked a lot of my career in Indonesia, and now that program has gone to 5,000 visas a year. And it's been a very practical way that Australia's relations with Indonesia is sort of has been given a bit more grunt, right? So it's a cultural, political, and human relationship policy. It's separate from long-term residential outcomes that we're looking for, right? So to answer the first part of your question, which is what it brings. So what has working holiday arrangements brought to Australia? Why do we want to expand it with so many different countries? Why have we? I mean, now I understand through the political issue of housing pressures, there is a bit of pressure on such programs, but yet we see the benefits of it, both from a temporary labor force to the cultural exchange, to the tourism boost. Remember, these working holiday makers bring their own cash, bring their own money, they spend it, they earn money and they spend money in Australia, they pay taxes. I'm not saying that we should have thousands of visas per year. Some of the programs, if you look at the list, are 200. I think the smallest program is 50 with one of the countries. And so what it does is it expands it. And it's also the symbolic importance, I think. I think it's rather unusual that we have these programs with basically every continent, bar Antarctica, which obviously does not have inhabitants, but we don't have one with a single country in Africa.
Why do you think that is?
I think it's both a demand and a supply issue. I think there's been very few African countries that have been advocating for it. I know there have been some that have, and they've been told no. I think that's part of the reason, but it's also, I think the interest has come at a time when those programs are being looked at more microscopically because of the housing pressure. We've only talked about this for the last 3 or 4 years when the pressure on housing has increased. So I think the timing has not been great, but it's also a sense of Africa doesn't matter, you know?
Yeah, and that seems to be a theme that's come through today, and in particular, I think there's an element in that which people have identified as racism. Yeah. Do you think, in your experience in dealing with Africa and also on the Australian side of things, what do you consider the role of perception and the perception within the Australian population to Africa, and how that affects I guess how that affects our interactions
policy
with
development interaction. Yeah. I think I wouldn't put it down. I think primarily is a lack of knowledge, a lack of understanding of what actually is happening in Africa. Lack of, distance is one thing, and also if I can compare it to, say, Latin America, right? And you have in global cultural terms, if I can, the Latin American culture has been able to be portrayed as a lot more interesting, fun, and diverse, whereas the perception of Africa that we get through our TV screens, unfortunately, is not that. It's war, it's famine, it's coup d'etats, it's that, and we do not get a balancing view of that. Like, we don't get the view of the economic development of certain parts of Africa, of North Africa. If you've visited Morocco, or if you've visited Nigeria in the last few years, or if you've visited Botswana, if you visited even Kenya and Tanzania, you'd see the development, you'd see the technology. Of course, it's coming from a lower base. So I think it's more a perception of that comes from not knowing, a lack of knowledge. Australians don't travel to Africa that much, and if they do, it's to a very limited zone, to very limited zones. And I think that comes with bias. From when it comes to trade and commercial relationship, I think it comes from that bias rather than a kind of a deep racism. I think that would be my view.
Yeah. Well, that's reassuring, because what that does mean is it's potentially there's an opportunity to correct some of that through better communication on both African nations' part, but also on the Australian government's part.
Yep.
I think that's all from me.
Great, thank you. We've heard a lot today as well about a lack of, an overarching framework between Australia and Africa. And I'm just wondering, I know we've also heard, there's a lack of, obviously, trade agreements and things like that. Do you think that could be a reason why we don't have the working holiday?
No, I think
this is a part of an agreement. Or?
I think that architecture, trade agreements are important, at the very least symbolic, but it does have practical consequences as well, and that helps. I think the signature, and I think I've put it in my submission, of the Africa Free Trade Agreement, you know, the intra-Africa Free Trade Agreement, potentially over the longer term provides some opportunities. I do think my own personal belief is free trade agreements are good, but they do not, I mean, they're not a magic bullet. They do provide some protections, you know, the ISDS provisions, you know, give some security for investment protection. But I think it hasn't limited, for example, in the right sectors, Australian investment in Africa, right? Mm-hmm. Australian investment in Africa is quite significant, and it's much more significant than some of Australian investment to some of our more nearer neighbors. And that's a point that is rarely brought up. For example, the Australian government is obviously very focused on increasing investment in Southeast Asia. And I used to work in Southeast Asia a lot, and I'm originally from Southeast Asia. But it's been a struggle, right? Part of the reason is structural, because where do Australian companies invest overseas? They tend to invest in natural resources. And in Southeast Asia, it's a very mature natural resources market. And it's also becoming increasingly difficult to say invest in natural resources in some countries in Southeast Asia. Whereas in Africa, the need for investment in mining and oil and gas is quite extensive. So Australian investment has flowed there. So the market will, in a way, lead investment to where it should go. But the people-to-people connections have not followed. And I think that is one of the reasons that the demand and the push for a work and holiday arrangement with one country in Africa hasn't been preeminent.
Interesting. Okay, so I think we're okay there. All right, so thank you very much for your time today. It's been very helpful. If you have been asked to provide any additional information, please forward that to the Secretariat. And please note that responses to questions on notice will be published on the website as submissions to the inquiry. You will be sent a copy of the transcript of your evidence to assist you with answering any questions taken on notice today. And you will have an opportunity to request corrections to any transcription errors. I now suspend the hearing. The public hearing. I now welcome representatives from the Australian Africa Minerals and Energy Group to give evidence today. For the Hansard record, would you please state your name and the capacity in which you appear before the Trade Subcommittee?
Thank you. My name is Doug Horrock. I'm the Chief Executive Officer of the Australia Africa Minerals and Energy Group. We are a peak industry body in the resource sector, highly focused on supporting Australian companies in Africa.
Great.
And
Oh, yeah, that's okay for the moment. Yeah, thank you. Although the subcommittee does not require you to give evidence under oath, I should advise you that this hearing is a legal proceeding of the Parliament. The giving of false or misleading evidence is a serious matter and may be regarded as a contempt of Parliament. The evidence given today will be recorded by Hansard and attracts parliamentary privilege. And joining the hearing today?
I'm Leon Rebello. I'm the federal member for McPherson on the Gold Coast.
And I'm Fiona Phillips, the federal member for Gilmore on the New South Wales South Coast. I now invite you to make a brief opening statement before we proceed to discussion.
Sure, thank you, and welcome. The Australia-Africa Minerals and Energy Group is a peak mining industry body. We look at how we can best support the Australian companies operating in Africa, largely mining and resource focused, and that includes mining companies and service companies. But it does extend into some of the other areas just by nature of the requirements on the ground in particular regions. And so we work very closely where we can with the education sector in Western Australia that we can help develop and close some gaps in the different regions around skills, training, skills assessment, certification, that sort of thing. And I think that'll be it'll continue to be a theme across the continent in terms of the areas we operate in. In broad context, currently there will be well over 100 mining companies that are in Africa operating at some level, and possibly between 32 and 34 countries where they are present of the 54. And when I say at the level they're operating, early stage exploration, you could have a single mining entity with 2 or 3 different exploration interests or projects across 3 different countries or jurisdictions, and they may be at different stages. So not all 100 plus would be in the productions phase yet, but ultimately that's the idea, is that most of those will get off the ground in time, provided they find resource.
Okay, I'm just really curious. So what? I mean, we've heard about different opportunities within Africa, but yeah, what can I guess be learnt from the mining sector? Obviously, it's been quite successful. So yeah, what advice would there be for the government or anyone else wanting to expand trade?
That's a really good question, right? I think obviously, based on my accent, I grew up on a farm in southern Africa, and I've been living in Australia for the last almost 20 years. And so my expectation of government and what government should be doing is very different from someone who's been born in Australia. The expectation from an Australian citizen on government in terms of producing and delivering is far more excessive than what I grew up understanding and expecting. And in that context, my expectations of the Australian government would be more how to enable and further secure the current investment and footprint. When I step back and I look at the Australia focus, and I absolutely understand the Asia, Southeast Asia focus, I get that. Africa for me is a strategic hedge against Southeast Asia in terms of our future. We can't be naive to think that Southeast Asia is our solution. It's not. It's part of the solution of our future. The Africa time zone and opportunity is far more significant in terms of some of our greatest strengths from the mineral resources sector, the education sector, defense sector, infrastructure. We have all of these incredible industries and incredible experience, and having had to have honed those services and skills in high cost environments. And so by deploying that expertise across that continent has significant opportunity for gain. I think we tend to forget, going back to the 100-odd mining companies, you've probably got 3 to 4 times that number of mining service companies across that continent. And so at a very base level, you probably have 1,000+ ambassadors, Australian ambassadors already on that continent. And in terms of employing people on that continent, it's tens of thousands of people, local Indigenous people that have an Australian experience to a degree. And when you look at the impact of those tens of thousands of people, generally representing a population of between 6 and 10 times that number. And so what I mean by that is if you are operating a laboratory group, for example, in a small laboratory lab in Zambia, which I did, was my previous role, and we had 11 employees. When you started looking at the impact of those 11 employees and that employment and the number of dependents they had, that was post 100 people straight away. And so the actual industrialization effect that mining and the associated services for mining has across that continent is dramatic. And it's life-changing and it's generational change. It's probably the most effective, efficient way one could deploy a strategic advancement into that region is through our mining and mining service companies, our education suppliers working with those groups, and then leading into infrastructure, defense opportunities. It's a massive, massive opportunity. One of the figures that continues to remind me of just what that opportunity is like and some of the challenges faced by that continent is that by 2030, it is expected there will be more young people joining the workforce in Africa than the entire world combined. And they believe that'll continue for the next 20 years. So you have this perfect storm where we have this ability through mining resources, mining service providers, to help create that long-term security sustainability. And we can deploy that very easily. There's been a lot of our traditional focus in the education space has been focused on bringing great talent into Africa, putting them here, delivering PhDs, some returning, some remaining. We haven't ventured enough with organizations on the continent and building and assisting in building that capacity. So the West Australian School of Mines working with the Tanzanian Institute of Mining and vice versa, and having the ability to create certification that sits in an environment where you've got Australian mining companies, service companies operating and now have access to skill sets that meet the standards that Australian and ASX listed companies operate at. So, yeah, I think it's really a case of how do you enable those people to do more with what they've got? And there's a great interest from the people on the ground to deliver that. If I can make a couple of comments about, the people that Australia does have on the ground at government, and when I say government, the heads of mission, Austrade, the limited sort of capacity they have, that's one thing. One of the main restrictions, and I say frustrating, because a lot of those people are incredibly good people, with incredibly good CVs, with incredible ability to deliver what it is they're supposed to deliver. But they are, and West Africa is a good example. I was talking to representatives saying, right, we're looking at taking a group of people into Côte d'Ivoire, and we think it makes great sense to have Austrade partner with us at one of their major mining events, holding events, building that bilateral collaboration. And the response was, Doug, we can't travel to Côte d'Ivoire. And I'm like, what do you mean you can't travel? Well, no one will sign off because it's a exercise a high degree of caution, travel within the government. So you've got people that are in these places that can't travel to the destinations that they're representing and are supposed to be building the trade with, right? So I think we continually shoot ourselves in the foot. I mean, if you have a look at West Africa per se, and Ghana is where our current High Commission sits and is responsible, I think, for 9 countries. And of those 9 countries, all of them, bar 2, exercise a high degree of caution when travelling, and the other two are do not travel, which is crazy because one mining company, West African Resources, that is in Burkina Faso, currently have a market cap of about $3 billion. They have been operating in that country since early 2020, I think, or maybe 18. Within 4 years of discovering gold to pouring gold, they were able to complete that in 4 years, which is unheard of. It certainly can't do that in Australia. So their investors, for their high-risk investment, were starting to get returns and had 6 years of returns before you're likely to achieve the same within our space. Back to West Africa Mining, they have and have been the biggest foreign direct investor into Burkina Faso and continue to be. I think their revenue generated in 25 was about $1.5 billion. When you have a look at 5 companies that are currently in production on the continent, so West African Resources, Sandfire, Perseus, Paladin, and Predictive Discoveries more recently, their market cap is over 20 billion. And so they have a significant impact. And these are Australian ASX-listed companies operating at the highest level in terms of being able to create and help drive that industrialization on the ground. And in some of these regions are tricky. They're not easy to operate in, but they're still, in spite of that, delivering incredible shareholder value, which comes back to Australia. They are delivering incredible infrastructure into these different regions and making a massive, massive input and doing it very, very well.
I'm just interested, so with that example, I think it was the West African, the
Resources
there.
Yes.
So, and you're talking about putting infrastructure into the community. How many people would be employed? Like, how does it support that community?
Yeah. So I think, and I think again, there isn't, it would be great if there was a single model that worked across every country, right? Which just is not possible. And I think again, similarly, within the West Australian context where some of our mines are in the middle of nowhere. It's exactly the same in Africa, right? These regions where these resources are far from CBDs, far from, but they tend to have the ability to attract, and they do attract and broaden communities. And mining companies, where they differ from some of the service or engineering companies which are project-based and project-related, they're looking at a 5, 10, 15, 20-year mine life. So their opportunity or their requirement is not a short-term solution. It's a long-term engagement, a long-term plan, and looking at what that looks like for that entire region, that not only the communities, but the region, and then at federal government and stuff. So their plans have to encompass everything around what that mining looks like from an infrastructure perspective. So if they are building a road or bridges, or if they are investing in schools, or if they're investing in clinics, or if they are investing in joint programs with government to deliver road infrastructure, it's something that they continue to build on. And the minute you start, and again, I wish I could show you what happens when someone discovers something in the middle of nowhere and a unsealed, barely travelable road becomes a sealed road. Power comes into that region, and that mine site starts building and evolving through construction and production and the impact of that entire region just shifts. Suddenly there are restaurants along the road. Suddenly there are service stations. Suddenly there is infrastructure. And that comes because people have the base level of infrastructure to then build. And the populations of the communities get uplifted, and that just continues. So there are countless stories of where a local village chief's son has been able to be educated at a high school, has gone to university, comes back and is now running the IT department for the mining company, right? Because this is the thing about mining, is that it's not a 2-year project. It's not a short-term, we are building a few aid stations. It is there for the life of that mine, and in all likelihood, that's going to be 15, 20, 30 years plus, depending on the resource, right? And so, sorry, yeah.
Oh, no, I was just going to say, and does that, I guess, catapult other types of businesses like agriculture?
Absolutely.
off
So,
that?
so some, and you're probably not aware, right? So, a really great example of exactly that was a company called Base Resources, which deployed in mineral sands in Kenya, where they actually then collaborated with the agriculture sector in Australia, produced cotton in and around the mining for the community. That cotton actually then got sold into an Australian group called Cotton On. And so they closed the entire loop. So by the time Base has now left Kenya, they now are, well, they were acquired by a US company, but they now have an operation in Madagascar. But all of that infrastructure, the agriculture, all of that trade that has been delivered by that continues, right? And so that long-term infrastructure is one thing. So mining for me is this great little catalyst. It's not going to last forever, but whatever comes around it does last forever. And this is what people miss, is they look at a very short-term period as to what it looks like. The impact is dramatic, and it is, I say, it changes generations. It really, really does. And it's difficult to understand that if you haven't seen it on the ground. It makes a massive difference.
And just one other question. So what in your view, I know we've talked about lots of opportunities,
Sure.
but what are the key barriers for Australian mining and energy companies operating in Africa?
I think the key barriers are, and going back to the enablement conversation from I guess, a government perspective, is that probably 2 years ago now, or maybe a bit more, my predecessor and a group of lawyers put a huge paper to the government around bilateral trade agreements and what that looks like and the potential that then unlocks. And I can illustrate that by a practical example. So currently a Australian company that, for example, is busy with, let's pick uranium in Namibia, in order to protect that long-term investment, because as we've just discussed, those mines are likely to be continuing and going long after we've passed. And the investment and the people investing in that want the certainty about the returns on what that money looks like, and at least a level of protection. Currently, there is no bilateral treaty or double tax arrangements with any of the African nations. And so they're then having to structure that business through probably Denmark or Belgium or one of the others that have a bilateral relationship there so that they can protect that investment. So what that then does is it removes the ability and it makes entry into that region that much more complicated, because you're now setting up separate business structures in foreign destinations that have favorable trade agreements to enable that trade to take place anyway. So we keep handing over these opportunities to these middlemen that sit across the world, and we don't leverage that. And if those things were made a little bit easier, there would be a significant opportunity, and it broadens the space. I say that. I remind people in Western Australia and broader Australia that if we could pick the entire West Australian mining industry up and dump them into that continent, it would barely make a dent in terms of the opportunity. It really would barely make a dent. There's been quite a bit said, and you would have heard it consistently through this, about the Australia footprint or the heads of mission or embassy footprint and Austrade footprint. When you look at countries like China, I think they have pretty much 54 embassy type arrangements across that continent. And we are not the same size as a China. But you look at Turkey have 44. You look at Russia have 45. I think the Canadians have 26. I think the Brits have about 24. Now, some of those countries are far bigger in population, but none of those countries are bigger than us in footprint in terms of mining and resources. A lot of those countries in that space are probably second, third on the list when it comes to, and I'm talking Western, I'm excluding China out of that now. When you're talking about UK, Canada, we are so far ahead in terms of number of people on the ground, the value we're adding on the ground, the impact we're having on the ground than any of the other regions. and yet we have a very tiny diplomatic footprint. And again, I don't expect that to change in the foreseeable future. That's not my expectation, because my expectation would be to leverage the 1,000+ Australian ambassadors we have across that continent already and make sure that we're doing as much as we possibly can to assist them. And that doesn't have to be through the high commissions or whatever it is. I think there are other mechanisms. I think for the Australian to recognise and to potentially start taking advantage of what that opportunity looks like, I don't think you need to have 50 embassies across Africa. I think you need to have a very serious Africa-based office in Western Australia, because this is where the companies are that operate there. And just through putting someone on the ground here that can leverage and work and understand what that looks like, that in itself would shift the whole dynamic. The Canberra idea is great. Canberra serves a purpose. But in terms of the trade and what that looks like, you know, at state level, I think there is one trade advisor for the entire Indian Ocean rim. And again, that's my expectation is not that we have 50. It still won't make a dent, right? But we already have this incredible footprint and we're just not leveraging it enough. We really are not. Sorry, I've rambled.
That's all right. Thank you. Mr. Rebello.
Thank you very much, Chair. You touched on China.
Yes.
And you spoke about the 54 embassies.
Yep.
And you also spoke about the opportunity that is available to Australia in Africa if we seize it.
Yep.
Could you speak to, apart from the diplomatic footprints, which is what you've spoken to, examples of other countries seizing the opportunities of Africa?
Sure. Japan and Korea, for example. Okay. Most people would identify them as, I guess, middle powers, so we could probably liken them to what Australia does. Both those countries have direct investment funds, dramatically sized investment funds into Namibia. And that helps build infrastructure, it helps build and secure their access to minerals, etc. So, and I stand to be corrected. I don't remember the actual numbers in terms of size of funds that are driven out of Japan and Korea, but it's significant. And so they have this ability to deploy that capital in projects that make sense and assist with sort of public partnerships in these regions that have then a dramatic impact, right? And their model is slightly different from the traditional China model, which China will, generally, and again, this is a very general comment, will build infrastructure. So they will deliver road infrastructure, port infrastructure, airport infrastructure, rail infrastructure, and they will fund that infrastructure. And it'll be at probably 5 to 6 times of what the cost is, so that that country remains indebted in one way or another to China in terms of repaying debts. And when the defaults come through, they then either do one of two things: acquire local resource assets or sign agreements. And there's a copper agreement in DRC that I think was signed in 2008, if I remember correctly, at 2008 prices, which extended for about the next 50 years at those prices. So they have the ability to deliver that. So now that's not Australia, right? We're never going to be able to do that because we don't have that ability to deploy capital in that sort of way. But when you look at some of the other powers, like the likes of Japan, Korea, and South Korea, when I talk about Korea, they have earmarked these investment funds to look at it. I mean, most recently we saw Poland, and again, I'm not going to remember which, I want to say Uganda, but I might have that wrong. And Poland have now stepped into investment in a particular region of Africa, or a particular country in Africa. And Poland are not by any stretch a China or a USA, but they understand the importance of what that looks like going forward. In the last 2 years, we've seen the US deliver significant amounts of capital into investment in Africa. And one of the ironies of that is that one of the companies that is part of our group has now an office in Washington, and they are helping deploying that capital across the continent. So they are operating at a level which we can aspire to, I guess, maybe, but practically probably not possible. There's also been a change in the shift of what America is how they're viewing things. So it's not about just acquiring the asset in the ground like they did recently in the DRC. Probably 2 months ago, they have now set up a fund between the US and the UAE where they will fund a mining police force, for want of a better word, to manage illegal mining, to make sure that the regions are stable, because they've realized very quickly that having the asset in the ground and being able to pull it out and put it into a concentrate is great. But if you can't get it out the gate or get it from the gate to the port because there's civil unrest or because it's a region that has potential conflict or is currently having some conflict, there has to be a way of stabilizing the region. And so by the end of this year, that force is supposed to be 3,000 strong. By the end of 28, that force is planned to be at 30,000 strong. Now, that's a significant undertaking and realization of how important that region is, how important the resources are, and how important being able to protect the supply chain and infrastructure is, right?
Thank you. And just on that, so you've spoken about about the Chinese model of investment in Africa, which was actually one of my other questions.
Yep.
And you've said that the Australians we obviously can't match that level of capital investment in Africa. Is there any opportunity, you think, actually I have two questions. So the first question is, are we starting to see a change in the Chinese investment? Is Africa still accepting it in the current way that it has for some time, or are they starting to catch on to the fact that these are the consequences of investing it? And the second question is, the consequences of accepting it. And the second question is there any opportunity for Australia to partner with like-minded countries to build that,
absolutely,
the things that we need to, and do we do that? My understanding is that we don't, but you know, if we, along with Canada, with the United Kingdom, other countries, we're doing that, would that be an effective way to improve our trade relationship with Africa?
Yeah, absolutely, without a shadow of a doubt. And going back to your first question, so a couple of things have happened in the last sort of 5-6 years, and then again, as I referred to, the last 2 years with the US entering the Africa arena from an investment perspective. Just before that, we've seen, I think there are now 2 large European funds that fund investment into Africa, and the UK last year delivered their first export fund into Africa. And actually they did a presentation here, and I think it was $200 or $300 million, and by the end of that week, that allocation was gone. And so they would have gone back and hoping to expand and grow that allocation, right? So they are starting to make those investments at those levels. Previous to that, China, Russia, Turkey would have been the only game in town for a lot of countries, right? About 5 years ago, and maybe a little bit 5-6 years ago, we saw the Middle East starting to enter Africa from an investment perspective in a significant way. And so now the current conversation around, if you want to call it the African government boardroom tables, is they're able to talk to certainly the Chinese, the Russians to a degree, depending on which part of Africa we're talking about, depending on those relationships. Certainly the Europeans and individual European countries, the UK, the Middle East and Near East, and the US now, right? So the dance card is a lot fuller now. So going to your first question, they are now having options that they never had before. So I do think that will help shift the conversation. However, there are some areas that are very strongly entrenched within the China, Russia, Turkey sort of space. And I'm not sure we can dislodge that. I think there's great opportunities to be in the same place and deliver value. However, there are a number of regions where, going to your second part of your question, there are significant opportunities to uplift, to invest, to get, and again, going back to one of the first points I made around the growth and the rapid youth population expansion, where we could make significant inroads around delivering what it is and the capabilities that we have into that continent by partnering with some of the larger powers and some of the other middle powers.
Where Australia does invest in Africa, as in where we are on the ground in Africa, what's the local view of Australia?
They wish, and I don't say this flippantly, but they wish that all countries invested in their countries and regions like Australian companies do.
So we have a fairly positive and
extremely positive, you know, and to the point of where those relationships last decades and decades and decades and decades. I mean, Bill Turner is someone probably not known to you, but he was in the DRC probably 35, 40 years ago, and he's still in touch with a lot of the community, a lot of the people that he was working with then, and has seen them move through the ranks and have seen that. So there's this huge, the amount of goodwill, and going back to my word of ambassadors on the ground for Australia in Africa, I can't emphasize that enough in terms of what is being delivered there. It's hard to understand, it's hard to imagine. I think the other thing around the mining sector and the mining industry in general, and part of that is, I guess, my job, is that we are great at delivering mine sites functioning, great returns to investors. We're not necessarily as good as telling the stories about what it is and the impact we do and the positive impact we have, right? And I think that often gets lost in the noise around Africa. There was an incident in Mali probably a year and a bit ago where one of the CEOs were detained because there was some dispute around tax and royalties for a particular government. And unfortunately, one of our very powerful premiers in Australia just had a throwaway comment about, well, that's what you get for going to Africa. And I mean, it's so disappointing when you hear that, because there is absolutely no context to that comment and that conversation, and yet that gets spewed out everywhere, right? So again, someone who might have been interested just based on that alone will sort of cut that out, right? Yeah, so I think there's incredible opportunity to do and position Australia and leveraging our strengths, and our strengths are mining and resources and our met sectors and our technology. It's a no-brainer. We're already doing it. And I think we have this ability now to bring the capacity building, the training, the education onto the continent. I'm not talking about bringing people into Western Australia. I'm really saying with the technology we have in terms of webinars, collaboration, you could have a lecturer from Western Australian School of Mines delivering lectures online for 2 weeks, delivering a 2-week course in the University of Namibia, and by the end of that course or year, whatever it is, having a very comprehensive certification being delivered back to the individual or group or whatever it is around that. And again, from a capacity building perspective, there's a huge opportunity there.
Yeah, can I just ask a question based on that as well? So
Yes.
I wanted to talk, if you could talk more about the role your members play
Yes.
in vocational training,
Yep.
like on the ground, and what further opportunities there are to assist.
Yeah. So, again, that we could talk about this probably for hours, right? Depending on the region and the level of maturity within the mining sector within that particular country, it varies dramatically. Yeah. Okay. But I can talk to a bunch of examples. So, in Tanzania, for example, who have very capable mining training schools and things like that, you've got relatively good skill sets across certain areas. But there are still gaps in when it comes to community training, community education, community upliftment, because those tend to be in Dar es Salaam or some of the mining centres, right? And so what we see Australian mining companies do, and partnering sometimes with NGOs, or doing and delivering themselves, or with their mining contracting companies, are setting up things like a training and education centre that teaches the very basics. And when I say the basics, I'm talking from welding and to construction, because when you look at these opportunities from a mining perspective, in the early stage, you have very little footprint on the ground, and then as you find and discover something, that then starts to increase. And more often than not, the resources are close to communities, so down the line, if a mine is built, that community will need to be moved. And so by empowering and training community people to be able to build, construct, basic electrician work, welding, etc., they empower the community to build the houses that they are going to be living in further down the track. And so it's and then another example is, for example, creating women's sewing businesses that empower them to then deliver all of the PPE requirements for that particular mine site and beyond, right? So setting up sewing machines, setting up sewing groups, getting the raw materials in, and then purchasing the finished garments back into the mining companies and into the PPE requirements that is required there. And those things then, and again, depending on the level of or size and success, that can then be exported back internally in that country. And I say exported, moved regionally or nationally in terms of what they develop, in these areas. So in that environment, you have the ability to impact at a very base community level to a degree, which then enables the next or their children and children's children potentially to be able to get to school, to get an education. And again, at that level, we have this ability to, again, add significant value around the TAFE scenarios, the West Australian School of Mines, the Curtin universities, and others, to then look at what those education levels look like. But training takes on, and capacity building takes on, so many dynamics across that life of mine and the community and where the particular mine is. And so the opportunity there is, again, significant. The other perfect storm aligned to the population growth that I was talking about is that countries and governments across the continent are pushing very hard at how do we insist or enforce local procurement, local content requirement? How do we get to local ownership requirements? And there's some examples where countries are going too far in that context. And Ghana is a great example of that currently, where they have banned all surface mining activity from anyone that's not Ghanaian. So effectively, any international company that was involved in surface mining in Ghana no longer can operate there. So they have had to leave and relocate. But a lot of them are in, and when I say a lot of them, a lot of the countries are in that stage to say, how do we build these partnerships? How do we create these collaborative environments that we can then help scale up, build our own capacity, and then at the same time protect the people that are helping us in the mining services sector? Because ultimately, when you look at, and Sandfire is a great one in Botswana, right? I want to say 98% of their workforce are Botswana, all Botswana. So tiny percent are expats. And that is a very good example of what most mining sites look like. And then it's, do we have enough capacity? And again, going back to the country and the specific needs around it, in Botswana per se, they have got incredibly well-educated people. So, and similar to Nairobi, you will have people with MDAs, with double degrees, and that's not the issue. But the issue in Botswana is really good welders, really good blue collar, and they just do not have that capacity or that ability to actually build that sector. So we are finding that we're seeing some of the companies bringing the blue collar skills out of Zambia, for example, into Botswana, because that's where it is, or out of Tanzania, where they've got the blue collar skills. And they'll eventually build those skills in Botswana. But it's a gap that they currently have, that they're currently trying to deal with. So, yeah. Sorry, it's a bit of a long.
Yeah, no, it's fascinating. Do you have any other questions?
I think that's all from me. Thank
Yeah,
you, Chair.
I think I'm probably okay
Sorry,
too.
it's over time.
Thank you very much for your time today.
Very welcome.
If you have been asked to provide any additional information, I don't think we have, please forward it to the Secretariat. Please note that responses to questions on notice will be published on the website as submissions to the inquiry. You will be sent a copy of the transcript of your evidence to assist you with answering any questions taken on notice today, and you will have an opportunity to request corrections to any transcription errors. And I would like to thank committee members as well and all the witnesses for their time today, and I now declare this public hearing closed.